More than 2,200 years ago, you find yourself stepping into a world that has just been reshaped by force law and relentless ambition. The air feels heavier here, as if history itself has not yet settled. You are in the moment, after the long warring states period has ended, when fragmented kingdoms have finally been pulled into a single vast imperial system under what will be remembered as the Qin Empire. The land still feels unfamiliar, like a patchwork quilt that has only just been stitched together, threads, still visible seams, still raw. Dust drifts through early morning light as farmers pause in their fields, uncertain whether the world they knew yesterday still exists today. In the distance, you hear the faint rhythm of construction, of roads being carved and walls being raised. Everything feels temporary and permanent, at the same time as if the empire is both already complete and still becoming. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you would like, share in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. There is something strangely comforting about imagining all of us drifting through different time zones, together connected by quiet stories of the past. Now dim the lights. You begin your journey in the early Qin world, where records confirm that the unification under Qin rule did not feel peaceful or gentle for those living through it. It felt sudden, structured, and deeply intrusive. A council decree proves that entire regions were reorganized almost overnight into commanderies, stripping away old noble loyalties. One curious footnote in surviving writings suggests that some villages believed the sky itself had changed color after unification, though scholars bicker over whether this was metaphor or memory reshaped by fear. As you walk further into this landscape, you notice how the idea of identity itself is shifting. People no longer belong primarily to their old kingdoms. Instead, they belong to a system, a name, a law that stretches across thousands of miles. Your mind drifts through scattered settlements where farmers bow not only to local elders but to distant officials whose names they may never hear. The roads beneath your feet are newly standardized, surprisingly straight, cutting through hills and valleys with little regard for natural obstacles. You can almost feel the intention behind them. Movement is no longer just local. It is imperial. Carriages carrying officials pass you with a steady rhythm, their wheels, uniform, their purpose unmistakable. A curious footnote from later accounts mentions that some rural communities initially believed these roads were living things stretching and growing each night. Oddly enough, this belief may have been less superstition and more reflection of how rapidly infrastructure appeared during the Qin expansion. At the heart of this transformation stands the first emperor himself, Qin Shi Huang. Records confirm his authority was unlike anything seen before in the region. He did not rule as a king among equals, but as the absolute center of a newly defined universe of law. Every decision from taxation to travel carries the weight of his centralized vision. You begin to understand how deeply legalist philosophy shapes this world. In this system, law is not moral guidance, but mechanical enforcement. Reward and punishment are designed to be predictable, immediate, and unavoidable. A single missed duty can ripple outward into punishment for entire households. Historians still argue whether this strictness created stability or merely suppressed instability beneath fear. You pass a small farming settlement where life continues under this new order. Houses are simple, built from packed earth and timber. Smoke rises slowly from cooking fires, carrying the scent of millet and dried wood. Families move with practiced efficiency, each person assigned a role that feels less like choice and more like necessity. Records confirm that agricultural quotas are enforced with unusual precision. Grain is measured carefully, recorded by local clerks who travel from village to village. A council decree proves that even minor shortages could trigger investigation or punishment, ensuring that every field is tied directly to imperial survival. One strange anecdote preserved in later commentary suggests that some farmers began marking their grain jars with hidden symbols, not for rebellion, but simply to remember which belonged to the state and which to their own families. Scholars bicker over whether this reflects resistance or adaptation. As you continue, you notice the presence of officials more frequently. They are not loud figures. They do not need to be. Their authority is carried in bamboo slip seals and written orders. The bureaucracy is everywhere, yet almost invisible, like a net stretched across the land. A quiet tension settles into daily life. People speak carefully. Actions are measured. Even children learn early that mistakes are not private matters. And yet beneath this strict structure, life continues. Meals are shared. Fields are tended. Festivals still occur in quieter forms. A curious footnote suggests that some local spirits were quietly renamed to fit imperial categories, though historians still argue over whether this was official policy or later reinterpretation. You begin to feel the weight of a world where order is both protective and suffocating. Nothing is random anymore. Everything has a place. Everything has a record. As the light shifts across the fields, you realize that the Qin Empire is not just building control. It is building memory itself, deciding what will be remembered and what will be erased. You continue moving through this early Qin landscape, and the atmosphere subtly changes as the idea of authority becomes sharper, more concentrated, almost tangible in the air around you. It no longer feels like you are moving through a collection of villages loosely tied together. Instead, it feels as though everything now points toward a single unseen center, a presence that shapes decisions even when it is not physically visible. In the distance, you hear the steady movement of official processions. Records confirm that after unification, the former king of Qin adopted a new title, First Emperor, a deliberate step meant to signal that he stood above the old traditions of kingship. That change was not just symbolic. It redefined how power flowed through the empire. A council decree proves that regional rulers were stripped of hereditary authority and replaced with appointed administrators who answered directly to the center. As you pass along a dusty road, you notice something subtle but important. People no longer refer to local lords with familiarity. Instead, they speak of officials in formal tones, often lowering their voices, as if even memory of older systems might carry risk. Your mind drifts to how quickly social habits can change when law becomes absolute. A curious footnote in later writings suggests that some villagers initially believed the first emperor could see through written reports into their homes, as if the system itself granted him omnipresence. Oddly enough, this belief may not have been entirely metaphorical in their experience, since the bureaucracy truly did extend his reach into nearly every aspect of daily life. You begin to understand how the Qin system does not rely solely on physical force. It relies on structure. Every household is registered. Every adult male is recorded for labor or military service. Even small disagreements can escalate quickly because responsibility is collective. Historians still argue whether this system was designed primarily for efficiency or for psychological control. As you travel deeper into this world, you encounter officials more frequently. They carry wooden or bamboo documents carefully inscribed with standardized script. Records confirm that writing itself was recently unified under imperial order, replacing older regional variations. This means that messages now travel more smoothly across vast distances, but it also means that interpretation is tightly controlled. You pause near a small administrative post. Inside, clerks sit in quiet concentration copying documents with steady hands. The sound of brush on bamboo feels almost meditative, but beneath it lies a system of constant surveillance. A single miswritten character could alter tax obligations or determine punishment. One odd anecdote preserved in later commentary describes a clerk who reportedly dreamed in standardized script after years of work, unable to recall older regional writing styles. Scholars bicker over whether this reflects actual psychological adaptation or later exaggeration meant to illustrate bureaucratic intensity. As you continue, you begin to see how authority is not just enforced from above, but replicated at every level. Local leaders are responsible for ensuring compliance, and in turn they are monitored by higher officials. The structure resembles nested layers, each one watching the one below it. The first emperor's authority also extends into culture itself. Records confirm that measures, weights, and even axle widths of carts were standardized across the empire. This means that trade becomes smoother, but also that regional uniqueness slowly erodes. You notice carts passing you with identical wheel spacing and almost uncanny uniformity that suggests deliberate design rather than natural evolution. A council decree proves that even spoken communication was encouraged to align with official terminology, reducing ambiguity in law and commerce. You begin to realize how deeply this world values consistency over individuality. As you pass through a market town, the effects of this system become more visible. Merchants call out prices that follow standardized units. Goods are inspected with official scales. There is a strange comfort in predictability here, but also an underlying tension, as if deviation is no longer tolerated. A curious footnote suggests that some merchants secretly maintained older measurement traditions in hidden compartments of their stalls, using them for personal reference while still complying outwardly with imperial standards. Oddly enough, these parallel systems may have helped ease the transition for many communities. You also begin to notice how authority reshapes even physical landscapes. Roads are widened and straightened. Boundaries are redrawn. Entire regions are renamed under administrative logic rather than cultural history. The empire is not only ruling space, it is reorganizing it. Your thoughts drift to the first emperor himself again. Records confirm his belief that fragmentation had caused centuries of war, and only absolute unification could prevent further chaos. Yet historians still argue whether this vision of unity was driven by genuine desire for peace or by an unyielding need for control. As you move forward, you sense a subtle emotional shift in the people around you. There is order, yes, but also caution. Conversations are shorter. Laughter is quieter. Even celebrations feel carefully structured, as if Spontaneity itself has learned to bow before regulation. And yet beneath all of this, life continues in familiar rhythms. Farmers still tend fields. Children still play in narrow alleys. The empire is vast, but human habits persist in small, stubborn ways that no decree can fully erase. You begin to understand that the first emperor's authority is not simply about commands. It is about creating a world where those commands feel unavoidable, where structure replaces uncertainty, and where even imagination begins to adjust itself to law. As the road stretches ahead, you realize you are no longer just observing a kingdom. You are witnessing the construction of a system that intends to outlast memory itself. You move further into the expanding shape of the Qin Empire, and the world around you begins to feel less like scattered settlements tied together by authority, and more like a single organism quietly regulated by unseen mechanisms. The air carries the faint smell of ink and dust, and every path you take seems to eventually lead toward a post station, an administrative hut, or a checkpoint where someone is quietly recording something about you, even if you never notice it happening. Records confirm that the Qin bureaucracy did not grow randomly, but followed carefully designed tiers of administration, dividing land into commanderies and into counties. Each level had its own officials, each one accountable to the next. A council decree proves that this hierarchy was intentionally structured to eliminate hereditary power and replace it with appointment based on loyalty and performance. You begin to feel how deeply this system penetrates daily life, not loudly, but persistently like water shaping stone. Your mind drifts through a small administrative village where scribes sit at low wooden tables, carefully copying reports onto bamboo strips. The sound of brush strokes is steady, almost soothing, yet behind it lies a system that never truly rests. Every harvest, every labor assignment, every dispute is documented. Nothing is meant to remain unrecorded. A curious footnote from later writings suggests that some clerks began developing what they called tired characters, where frequently written words felt heavier or visually distorted after long hours of repetition. Oddly enough, this may reflect early awareness of cognitive fatigue and bureaucratic labor, though scholars still argue whether this description is literal or symbolic. As you continue, you notice that your presence in this world feels increasingly structured by documentation. At certain posts, officials glance at written passes before allowing passage. You realize that identity itself is becoming something external, something carried on bamboo rather than remembered in names or faces. You pass through a farming region where the rhythm of life is dictated by seasons and state demands. Records confirm that agricultural output was not only expected, but measured with precision, forming the backbone of imperial taxation. Farmers work long hours under a system where surplus is not simply stored for personal security, but partially absorbed by the state. A council decree proves that grain quotas were adjusted periodically based on population and military needs, ensuring constant supply for the empire's expanding ambitions. One curious anecdote preserved in regional commentary describes farmers quietly comparing harvest yields in coded gestures rather than spoken numbers, a small adaptation to avoid drawing official attention. Scholars bicker over whether this reflects subtle resistance or simply practical caution. The presence of the military begins to feel more pronounced as you move along the roads. Young men are occasionally escorted away by officials, their departure quiet but irreversible. Records confirm that conscription was mandatory for many adult males, often tied to both labor and military service obligations. This means that the empire's roads, walls, and campaigns are built not by volunteers, but by structured obligation. You begin to see how deeply the state relies on human movement. Labor is not stationary, it is mobilized. It shifts across regions depending on need, creating a constant flow of people who rarely remain in one place for long. A curious footnote suggests that some villages developed informal naming practices for conscript groups not officially recognized but used among families to track where loved ones had been sent. Oddly enough, these informal systems may have been more reliable than official records in some remote areas. As you continue, the landscape itself begins to feel increasingly engineered. Roads are straightened with almost unnatural precision. Bridges appear where rivers once dictated detours. You realize that geography is being rewritten not by nature, but by administrative intent. You pass another checkpoint, where a small group of travelers waits silently as officials inspect their documents. The process is not hostile, but it is absolute. There is no negotiation, only verification. Your mind drifts to how different this feels compared to earlier fragmented kingdoms, where local customs often determined movement. Records confirm that standardization extended beyond administration into daily tools and transport. Axle widths of carts were unified to ensure that vehicles could travel smoothly across imperial roads without obstruction. A council decree proves that even measurement systems were recalibrated to remove regional inconsistencies. This level of control creates efficiency, but it also creates uniformity that subtly erases local variation. One strange anecdote preserved in later texts describes villagers initially believing that standardized carts would eventually erase ruts from the earth itself, a poetic exaggeration that reflects how deeply infrastructure changes were felt at the time. Historians still argue whether such accounts are metaphorical or based on genuine early reactions. You begin to notice that language itself feels more structured. Official terminology appears repeatedly in conversations. Words that once had local variations are now replaced with standardized equivalents. This makes communication clearer, but also more constrained. A quiet thought settles in your mind as you walk. The Qin Empire is not only governing actions, it is shaping perception. It defines what is measurable, what is recordable, and therefore what is real within its system. As evening approaches, smoke rises from distant homes. Life continues with its familiar cycles, yet beneath them lies a framework of regulation that never fully disappears. Even rest is scheduled. Even absence is recorded. You realize that in this world, nothing is entirely outside the reach of structure, and as the roads stretch further ahead, it becomes increasingly difficult to imagine a place where the system does not eventually find you. You leave the administrative corridors behind and drift outward again, where the Qin Empire feels less like a map of offices and more like a living countryside reshaped by obligation. The land opens into fields that stretch in long, carefully divided strips, each one belonging to a household registered somewhere in the imperial ledgers. The wind moves low across young grain, and you can almost hear the quiet mathematics of survival playing out in every furrow of soil. Records confirm that after unification, land taxation and household registration became the backbone of rural life. A council decree proves that every family was assigned responsibility not only for cultivating land, but also for reporting production with precision. Your mind drifts through this structure, imagining how even the simplest harvest becomes part of a larger system of accounting that spans entire regions. You enter a border village small enough that its houses seem to lean toward each other for stability. Walls are made of packed earth, softened by years of wind and dust. Smoke curls from cooking pits carrying the scent of boiled millet and dried herbs. Life here feels grounded, repetitive, and deeply tied to seasonal cycles, yet always shadowed by the awareness of distant authority. A curious footnote suggests that some villages kept unofficial harvest. Memory stones, small markers buried in fields, to help farmers estimate yields before official inspections. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether these were practical tools or symbolic gestures of autonomy in a heavily regulated system. As you walk through the village, you notice how households are structured around obligation. Families are not just social units, but administrative ones. Each household is responsible for reporting its members' labor capacity and productivity. Records confirm that collective responsibility systems meant that neighbors could be held accountable for each other's actions if wrongdoing went unreported. This creates a social environment where silence can be as significant as speech. You pass a courtyard where children are helping gather firewood. Their movements are practiced, not playful. Even early training is shaped by awareness of duty. A council decree proves that young males were often registered early for future labor or military service, ensuring that the empire's needs were anticipated years in advance. One strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes a child who reportedly corrected an adult's measurement during grain storage inspections, earning praise from officials for early administrative awareness. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine practice or later moral storytelling meant to emphasize discipline. As you continue, you begin to notice the subtle presence of legalist philosophy in everyday interactions. Rules are not debated, they are followed. Deviations are corrected quickly, often through fines or collective penalties. There is little room for ambiguity, and this clarity creates both order and tension. Records confirm that legalist governance emphasized strict enforcement over moral persuasion. A council decree proves that rewards and punishments were designed to be immediate and visible, reinforcing predictable behavior. Your mind drifts through this system, imagining how it shapes not only actions but expectations. People begin to act not because they are watched constantly, but because they assume they might be. A curious footnote suggests that some villagers developed what later commentators called shadow etiquette, adjusting behavior, depending on whether officials were present or merely nearby. Oddly enough, this adaptation may have been more sophisticated than direct resistance, blending compliance with subtle self-preservation. You step into a small field where farmers are working in synchronized rhythms. The agricultural system relies heavily on millet and other hardy grains suited to varied climates. Records confirm that agricultural output was carefully monitored because it directly supported taxation and military provisioning. Every surplus sack of grain represents not just food, but imperial stability. As you observe, you notice how labor is coordinated with quiet precision. There is little wasted movement. Even rest seems scheduled around efficiency. Yet despite this structure, there is a quiet humanity in the way people speak to each other, exchanging brief comments, shared glances, and understated humor that never fully disappears. One curious anecdote preserved in regional accounts describes farmers secretly naming particularly fertile plots after family members or local spirits, even though official records assigned numerical designations. Scholars still argue whether this reflects emotional resistance or simple personal attachment. You also begin to see how taxation extends beyond grain. Cloth labor and service are all part of the system. Records confirm that households could be required to provide labor for infrastructure projects such as roads, walls, and canals. This creates a cyclical relationship between land labor and state demands. As you move further along the village edge, you notice a group preparing for departure. Young men are being gathered quietly, their belongings minimal. The atmosphere is restrained, almost ritualistic. There is no dramatic farewell, only structured transition. Military and labor conscription are deeply embedded in the social fabric. A council decree proves that conscription obligations were often rotated, ensuring a constant flow of manpower across regions. Historians still argue whether this system was sustainable in the long term or whether it placed excessive strain on rural communities. Your thoughts drift to how life here is shaped by anticipation. People prepare not just for what is happening, but for what might be required of them next by the state. This creates a subtle sense of forward tension, as if time itself is structured by obligation. As evening approaches, the village grows quieter. Fires are lit. Food is shared. The day's labor settles into memory. Yet beneath this calm surface, the administrative presence remains invisible, but constant, woven into every aspect of existence. You realize that in the Chin countryside, life is not simply lived. It is recorded, measured, and continuously adjusted to fit within a vast and carefully maintained system of order. And as you stand at the edge of the fields, watching shadows lengthen across the grain, you begin to understand how deeply this empire has reached into the soil itself. You continue onward, and the quiet structure of rural life begins to feel even more tightly bound by something you cannot quite see, as if the air itself has learned the language of rules. The fields thin out behind you, replaced by narrow paths that connect scattered settlements like threads in a vast woven net. Every step forward seems to bring you closer to the invisible weight of law that defines this empire. Records confirm that the Qin legal system was based on strict codified statutes rather than local custom. A council decree proves that these laws were distributed across the empire in standardized form, ensuring that judgment in one region mirrored judgment in another. Your mind drifts through the implications of this uniformity, imagining how unfamiliar it must have felt to people who once lived under varied local traditions. You pass a small village gate where an official notice is posted. It is written in standardized script, carefully aligned and deliberate. Even if you cannot fully read every character, the structure itself conveys authority. There is no ambiguity in its presentation. It is meant to be followed, not interpreted. A curious footnote suggests that some villagers believed reading official notices aloud at night could bring misfortune, as if the written word carried lingering authority even after darkness fell. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether this reflects superstition or an intuitive understanding of how deeply writing had become tied to power. As you move deeper into this legal world, you begin to feel how punishment is not random but systematic. Records confirm that the Qin system used clearly defined penalties tied to specific offenses, leaving little room for discretion. This creates predictability, but also an atmosphere where small mistakes carry disproportionate consequences. You encounter a local administrative post where disputes are being quietly resolved. A clerk listens without emotion, recording statements on bamboo slips. There is no dramatic argument, no emotional appeal that changes the outcome. The system is designed to function regardless of personal feeling. A council decree proves that collective responsibility laws meant that households or groups could be punished together if wrongdoing was not reported. This encourages vigilance among neighbors, creating a social environment where silence can itself become a form of risk. One strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes villagers subtly shifting seating arrangements during meetings to indicate who they believed might be under suspicion, a silent language of caution rather than accusation. Historians still argue whether such behavior was widespread or exaggerated in later moral commentary. You continue along a road where labor teams are repairing a drainage channel. Their movements are coordinated, almost rhythmic, driven by overseers who carry wooden tablets marking quotas and progress. Records confirm that large-scale infrastructure projects were essential to maintaining agricultural productivity and military logistics. Your mind drifts through the logic of this system. Every canal dug, every road built, every wall extended is part of a larger design that connects villages to the center. There is a sense that nothing exists independently anymore. Everything serves a function within a greater whole. A curious footnote suggests that some laborers marked milestones in hidden ways along construction routes, carving small symbols into stones to track personal participation in imperial projects. Oddly enough, these marks were rarely official, but they may have served as private records of endurance. As you walk, you notice how legalist principles shape even interpersonal behavior. Rewards are given for reporting violations, while failure to report can itself become punishable. This creates a system where law enforcement is distributed across the population rather than centralized alone. Records confirm that this approach was intended to reduce corruption and increase compliance. A council decree proves that officials were evaluated based on measurable outcomes rather than reputation, reinforcing the idea that performance, not status, determined authority. You begin to feel the psychological texture of this world. People speak carefully. Actions are measured. Even kindness seems structured, as if it must exist within permissible boundaries. One curious anecdote describes a traveler who reportedly memorized legal codes not for professional duty, but simply to avoid accidental violations while moving between regions. Scholars still argue whether this reflects the complexity of law or the anxiety it produced among ordinary citizens. As you pass another checkpoint, you observe how identity is verified through written records rather than personal recognition. You realize that in this world, being known is less important than being documented. Existence itself is tied to administrative acknowledgement. Your thoughts drift to how this system might feel from within. On one hand, it offers clarity. There is no ambiguity about expectations. On the other hand, it removes uncertainty in a way that leaves little space for deviation or improvisation. As evening begins to fall, you hear distant sounds of movement returning to villages. Life continues in structured rhythms. Meals are prepared, families gather, yet beneath it all the legal framework remains present, like an unseen lattice holding everything in place. You realize that the Qin Empire does not rely solely on force or fear. It relies on predictability, on the belief that every action has a defined consequence and that nothing exists outside the reach of recorded law. And as you walk onward into the fading light, you begin to understand that in this world, even silence has rules. You move away from the roads and administrative posts, and the landscape begins to feel quieter again, though not less controlled. Instead of officials and decrees, you now encounter the intimate architecture of daily survival, the homes where the Qin system settles into human scale. The empire no longer feels distant here. It feels embedded in the walls themselves. Records confirm that most rural households during this period were constructed using rammed earth techniques, compacted layer by layer until the walls hardened like stone. A council decree proves that households were required to meet certain construction standards for durability, especially in border and agricultural regions. Your mind drifts as you imagine the sound of wooden frames being packed with soil, each strike of the tool, a small act of participation in imperial stability. You step closer to a cluster of homes. They are modest, rectangular, and tightly arranged, often sharing walls or courtyards to conserve space and resources. Smoke rises from cooking pits carrying the scent of grain porridge and dried herbs. Life here is enclosed not in a prison-like sense, but in a practical, structured way shaped by necessity and regulation. A curious footnote suggests that some households painted symbolic markings on interior walls to distinguish family roles or seasonal responsibilities, though scholars still argue whether these markings were decorative, ritualistic, or simply organizational aids in a system where literacy was uneven. Inside one home, you observe the rhythm of daily life. Family units are not just emotional structures, but economic and administrative ones. Records confirm that households were registered as units responsible for taxation, labor, and legal accountability. This means that identity is shared in a formal sense. One person's obligation can affect everyone under the same roof. Your mind drifts through this idea of collective responsibility. It is efficient from the state's perspective, ensuring compliance through mutual accountability. But from within the household, it creates a delicate balance, where individual actions carry communal weight. A council decree proves that households were often grouped into mutual responsibility units, where neighboring families were expected to monitor one another and report serious violations. Historians still argue whether this system increased social trust or quietly eroded it. You notice children moving through the courtyard, helping with chores that feel less like assigned tasks and more like natural extensions of daily life. Records confirm that children were introduced early to labor expectations, often assisting in agriculture, weaving, or household maintenance. Education is not separate from work here. It is woven directly into it. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes children playing a game where they mimicked official inspections, pretending to measure grain or check household records. Oddly enough, scholars still debate whether this reflects genuine cultural behavior or later interpretive storytelling meant to illustrate how deeply administration permeated society. As you continue observing, you begin to notice how space itself is organized around function. Storage areas are carefully allocated. Grain jars are positioned for inspection readiness. Even sleeping areas are arranged to maximize efficiency. There is little wasted room, little excess. Everything has a designated purpose. Records confirm that food production centered heavily on millet, supplemented by vegetables and occasional livestock. A council decree proves that grain storage was monitored due to its importance for taxation and military supply chains. Your mind drifts through the idea that food here is not just nourishment, but a unit of economic stability. You catch a glimpse of a family meal being prepared. The food is simple, but carefully portioned. There is a quiet rhythm to how resources are divided. No one appears wasteful. In this world, abundance is not assumed. It is managed. A curious footnote suggests that some households developed informal recipes designed to stretch grain supplies while maintaining flavor, though scholars still argue whether these were innovations born of hardship or simply traditional variations passed through generations. Outside, you hear the sound of wood being split. Fuel is gathered with discipline, often in designated areas. Even natural resources are organized under implicit expectations. The Qin system does not need to constantly enforce every action. It shapes behavior so thoroughly that much of it becomes self-regulating. Your thoughts drift to how legalist principles extend into domestic life. While laws are formal and written, their influence is also psychological. People anticipate enforcement even when it is not immediately visible. This creates a culture where compliance often precedes inspection. A council decree proves that households could be inspected without prior notice, reinforcing the idea that readiness must be constant. Historians still argue whether this unpredictability was intentional design or an emergent property of administrative expansion. You step back outside into the narrow lane between homes. The village feels orderly, but not cold. There is warmth in conversation, small exchanges of goods and news, subtle gestures of familiarity. Yet beneath this, the structure of obligation remains steady. A curious anecdote describes neighbors quietly exchanging labor during peak agricultural seasons without formal documentation, a practice that may have helped sustain communities during heavy demand periods. Oddly enough, scholars still debate whether such exchanges were tolerated unofficially or simply overlooked. As you move away from the homes, you begin to understand how deeply the Qin system integrates into private life. It does not replace family or tradition. It organizes them. It does not eliminate human behavior. It channels it into predictable forms. The evening light softens across the village. Fires glow gently behind earthen walls. The empire feels less like a distant authority and more like a structure embedded in daily breath and movement. And as you leave the household cluster behind, you realize that in this world, even intimacy is quietly shaped by law. You leave the clustered homes behind and step back into open land, where the Qin Empire reveals its most essential foundation, the fields that sustain everything else. The landscape stretches wide and methodical, divided into long, narrow strips that look almost as if they have been carefully measured by an invisible hand. The wind moves across them in steady waves, carrying dust pollen and the faint smell of earth that has been worked far too often to remain untouched. Records confirm that agriculture during the Qin period was highly organized under state supervision, with quotas assigned to households based on land size and labor capacity. A council decree proves that grain production was considered a matter of national security, not just local survival. Your mind drifts through this realization, understanding that every seed planted here is tied to a larger system of empire-wide demand. You walk along the edge of a millet field where farmers are bent low, their movements repetitive and practiced. There is a rhythm here, not chaotic, but structured as if labor itself has learned a pattern. The soil is dry in some places, damp in others, shaped by irrigation channels that cut through the land like veins. A curious footnote suggests that some farmers used informal planting songs to synchronize their work, quietly chanting rhythms to maintain group coordination. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether these songs were purely practical tools or carried older ritual meanings that predated imperial standardization. As you move closer, you notice how agricultural tools are simple but standardized. Iron plows, wooden handles, and uniform sickles appear across different farms with surprising consistency. Records confirm that the Qin state encouraged technological uniformity to improve efficiency and reduce variation in output. This creates a subtle sense of sameness across distant regions. Your thoughts drift through the idea that even soil preparation is shaped by governance. Fields are not just cultivated, they are measured, expected, and evaluated. A council decree proves that agricultural performance directly influenced taxation levels, creating a feedback loop between productivity and obligation. You watch as farmers pause briefly to inspect irrigation channels. Water is carefully directed through small canals, ensuring even distribution. In a world without modern machinery, this precision is achieved through collective coordination and constant maintenance. Historians still argue whether such systems were primarily state-designed or evolved from earlier local innovations later absorbed by Qin administration. Nearby, a group of workers adjusts a boundary marker between fields. Boundaries are not casual here. They are recorded, enforced, and occasionally revised by officials. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes disputes over field boundaries being resolved by measuring shadow lengths during midday inspections, though scholars debate the accuracy of this account. You continue walking and begin to feel how deeply the empire depends on agricultural stability. Without these fields, there is no army, no roads, no administration. Everything traces back to this quiet, repetitive labor under open sky. Records confirm that surplus grain was collected and redistributed through state granaries. This system ensured supply during shortages and military campaigns, but also meant that local autonomy over food storage was limited. Your mind drifts through the implications of this arrangement, where survival is shared but also regulated. A council decree proves that granary management was strictly monitored by appointed officials responsible for preventing waste and corruption. This introduces another layer of oversight into rural life, where even stored grain becomes part of bureaucratic attention. You notice a small granary structure near the edge of a settlement. It is raised slightly off the ground to protect against moisture and pests. Workers move in and out steadily, carrying sacks of grain under supervision. There is no sense of panic, only routine efficiency. A curious footnote suggests that some villagers believed granaries had symbolic significance beyond storage, viewing them as representations of imperial fortune itself. Oddly enough, scholars still debate whether such beliefs were encouraged or simply emerged from lived experience of dependency on state reserves. As you move further along the fields, you observe how labor obligations shape social structure. Families coordinate their work not only for personal benefit, but to meet collective quotas. This creates a shared sense of pressure, but also shared rhythm. Children help with lighter tasks, gathering debris or assisting with irrigation channels. Records confirm that agricultural training began early, blending skill acquisition with responsibility. There is no clear separation between childhood and labor preparation. You begin to notice how weather becomes a silent authority in this world. A poor season can ripple through taxation, labor requirements, and military provisioning. A council decree proves that adjustments to quotas were sometimes made in response to climatic variation, though enforcement remained strict. Your mind drifts through the vulnerability of this system. It is highly organized, yet deeply dependent on natural cycles that cannot be controlled. Historians still argue whether this tension contributed to later instability within the empire. As you pause at the edge of a field, you hear distant voices calling instructions across rows of crops. The sound is steady, not urgent, reflecting a long familiarity with repetition and expectation. A curious anecdote describes farmers timing irrigation cycles based on shadow positions cast by simple markers, a technique blending observation with tradition. Scholars debate whether such methods were widely standardized or locally adapted improvisations. The sun begins to lower, casting long lines across the fields. The land feels vast but contained, open, yet structured. You realize that agriculture here is not merely survival. It is the foundation upon which the entire Qin system rests, both physically and ideologically. And as you stand among the quiet rows of millet, you begin to understand that every grain of this empire carries the weight of expectation. You leave the fields behind, and the landscape subtly shifts again, not into wilderness, but into pathways of exchange where the empire's demands are collected, measured, and redistributed. The air carries a different tension here, quieter but more formal, as if every object and transaction has already been anticipated by someone far away. Records confirm that the Qin taxation system relied heavily on grain cloth and corvée labor obligations, rather than purely monetary systems in rural regions. A council decree proves that households were required to submit regular assessments of production, which determined their tax burden. Your mind drifts through this structure, realizing that what you produce is never entirely yours from the beginning. You approach a small roadside station where tax collectors are preparing their records. The scene is unremarkable at first glance, but the precision is striking. Bamboo slips are arranged carefully, ink brushes move with practiced efficiency, and weights are used to verify grain quantities. Everything is accounted for twice, sometimes 3 times. A curious footnote suggests that some villagers believed tax measurements were listened to rather than simply read, as if officials could detect dishonesty through tone or hesitation. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether this reflects superstition or the psychological pressure of inspection rituals. As you continue, you see farmers arriving with bundled goods, their expressions neutral but attentive. There is no visible conflict, only structured exchange. Goods are weighed, recorded, and accepted into state control. In return, obligations are marked as fulfilled. The process is transactional, but deeply asymmetric. Records confirm that grain collected through taxation was often transported to central granaries for redistribution. This system supported both administrative needs and military logistics, ensuring supply continuity across vast distances. Your thoughts drift through how this transforms agriculture into a national resource rather than a local asset. A council decree proves that tax officials were held accountable for discrepancies in record-keeping, reinforcing the importance of accuracy in documentation. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on precision reduced corruption or simply shifted it into more subtle forms. You walk alongside a convoy of carts carrying collected goods. The wheels move in a steady rhythm, aligned with standardized axle measurements introduced after unification. This uniformity allows movement across roads without obstruction, a small but powerful detail of imperial design. A strange anecdote preserved in later accounts describes villagers marking tax seasons not by calendars, but by the arrival of specific officials whose presence became a more reliable indicator than time itself. Scholars debate whether this reflects administrative predictability or rural dependence on external scheduling. Your mind drifts through the broader implication of this system. Taxation is not just extraction, it is coordination. It binds villages into a synchronized network of obligation and response. Even distance does not reduce its reach. As you pass another checkpoint, you notice a group of officials comparing records. Their expressions remain calm, but their attention is absolute. A small discrepancy can trigger investigation, correction, or punishment. The system is designed to self-correct through constant verification. Records confirm that some regions experience tax adjustments based on productivity or strategic importance. This suggests a level of administrative flexibility within an otherwise rigid framework. A council decree proves that such adjustments were authorized at higher levels of governance, reinforcing central oversight. A curious footnote suggests that some farmers attempted to smooth tax burdens by intentionally diversifying crops, though scholars still argue whether this was strategic adaptation or simply agricultural necessity shaped by terrain and climate. You continue along the road and begin to see how taxation extends beyond goods. Labor obligations are equally important. Construction projects, military service, and infrastructure maintenance all draw from the same pool of rural manpower. This creates a cycle where productivity and obligation continuously reinforce each other. Your thoughts drift through the emotional texture of this system. There is stability here, but also pressure. Predictability, but also constraint. People know what is expected, but that expectation is always present. A council decree proves that failure to meet obligations could result in collective penalties for households or communities. This ensures compliance, but also reinforces social interdependence. Historians still argue whether this system strengthened communal bonds or introduced quiet tension between neighbors. You observe a small group resting beside their carts. They speak quietly, sharing water and brief comments about harvest yields and travel conditions. Despite the administrative structure surrounding them, human interaction remains steady and familiar. A curious anecdote describes merchants secretly timing their travel to avoid peak inspection periods, though scholars debate whether this reflects widespread practice or isolated adaptation. As you move further, the road begins to widen slightly, indicating proximity to a more significant administrative route. The movement of goods increases. Carts pass more frequently. The rhythm of exchange becomes more visible. Records confirm that taxation routes were integrated with imperial road networks to streamline collection and distribution. This creates an interconnected system where infrastructure and administration function as one. Your mind drifts through the realization that the Qin Empire does not simply govern space, it organizes flow. Goods, labor, information, and obligation all move along structured pathways. As evening approaches, the convoy slows. Officials prepare final records for the day. Farmers begin their return journeys. The system pauses briefly, but it does not stop. And as you stand at the edge of the road, watching the last carts disappear into the fading light, you begin to understand that in this empire, even movement itself is measured and recorded. You continue along the widening imperial road, and the atmosphere shifts again, this time with a sharper sense of purpose. The quiet rhythm of taxation and agriculture begins to give way to something more direct, more unsettling in its certainty. The road itself feels like it is pulling you forward, as if it has already decided where you are meant to go. Records confirm that under Qin rule conscription was a formalized obligation tied to household registration, requiring eligible men to serve in military or labor capacities. A council decree proves that service could not easily be avoided, as obligations were tracked through centralized records shared between regions. Your mind drifts through this system, realizing that even absence from home does not remove you from imperial reach. You pass a small gathering point where officials are organizing groups of young men. There is no chaos here, only structure. Names are checked against bamboo registers, assignments are given, and departure routes are indicated. The process feels almost procedural, yet beneath it lies a quiet emotional weight that is never fully spoken aloud. A curious footnote suggests that some families marked conscription seasons by subtle household changes, such as adjusting meal portions or storing personal items in specific ways, as if preparing for absence long before it occurred. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether these practices were widespread cultural habits or later interpretations of fragmented records. As you move closer, you begin to observe the soldiers themselves. They are not yet on campaign, but in transition, carrying simple belongings and standardized equipment. Records confirm that Qin military organization relied on strict hierarchy and uniform armament systems, ensuring discipline and interoperability across regions. Your mind drifts through the idea that these men are both individuals and components of a larger mechanism. Their identities are recorded, their roles assigned, their movements anticipated. There is little room for uncertainty once the process begins. A council decree proves that military service was often rotated or reassigned based on imperial needs, meaning that soldiers could be moved between frontier defense construction labor or active campaigns. Historians still argue whether this flexibility improved efficiency or created instability in personal lives. You notice weapons being inspected nearby. Bronze and early iron implements are laid out in careful rows. Armor pieces are checked for uniformity. Even here, standardization is evident. The empire does not tolerate variation in its instruments of force. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes soldiers reportedly practicing synchronized movement drills until individual rhythm disappeared into collective motion. Oddly enough, scholars debate whether such accounts reflect actual training methods or later philosophical interpretations of discipline. You walk alongside a group preparing to depart. Their conversations are quiet, practical. There is little dramatic farewell. Instead, there is a sense of accepted transition as if this is simply the next stage in a known sequence of life. Records confirm that military service was closely tied to agricultural cycles, with deployment timing often adjusted to avoid disrupting harvest periods. This creates a delicate balance between sustaining food production and maintaining military readiness. Your thoughts drift through how deeply interconnected these systems are. Agriculture feeds taxation. Taxation supports administration. Administration enables military organization, and military power protects the system that sustains agriculture. A council decree proves that border defense was a primary concern of Qin governance, especially in northern regions, where incursions and unrest were historically frequent. This explains the growing emphasis on organized military infrastructure. You continue walking and begin to notice supply wagons moving in the opposite direction, carrying provisions toward staging areas. Grain tools and equipment are transported with careful coordination. Everything is planned, nothing is improvised. A curious footnote suggests that some families believed supplying soldiers with personal items, such as familiar clothing or food, could protect them spiritually during service. Scholars still argue whether this reflects genuine belief or emotional coping mechanisms. As you pass further along the road, you encounter small training grounds where recruits practice formations. Movements are repetitive and synchronized, emphasizing discipline over individuality. The sound of coordinated steps creates a steady rhythm across the open land. Records confirm that Qin military doctrine emphasized order obedience and structural cohesion rather than individual heroics. A council decree proves that commanders were evaluated based on measurable outcomes such as unit performance and logistical success. Your mind drifts through how this contrasts with earlier fragmented states where local militias often relied on personal loyalty. Here, loyalty is directed upward, through structure rather than outward, through relationships. A strange anecdote describes recruits reportedly becoming disoriented when returning home after long service, struggling to adjust to less structured environments. Oddly enough, scholars still debate whether this reflects psychological conditioning or later narrative exaggeration. You pause near a supply station where officials are documenting provisions. The precision is again striking. Every item is counted, recorded, and assigned. There is no waste in theory, only allocation. As evening approaches, the movement of soldiers and supplies continues steadily. The empire does not pause for emotional transitions. It operates through cycles of preparation and deployment. You realize that conscription here is not just about war. It is about integration. It binds individuals into the machinery of the state, ensuring that every capable body becomes part of a larger, coordinated system. And as you watch the road stretch into the distance carrying men, goods, and expectations away from you, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even departure is part of design. You follow the flow of movement away from the villages and fields, and the world begins to feel increasingly shaped by military presence. The road no longer feels like a neutral path of travel. It feels like a supply artery, feeding something larger, something constantly in motion, even when it appears still. Dust rises in thin layers under marching feet and cartwheels, settling briefly before being disturbed again by the next passing formation. Records confirm that Qin soldiers were equipped with standardized armor and weapons designed for consistency across units including bronze or early iron blades, spears, and crossbows in more developed formations. A council decree proves that military equipment was centrally produced or strictly regulated to ensure uniformity. Your mind drifts through the implications of this, where even tools of violence are part of administrative order. You walk alongside a staging camp where soldiers are organizing their belongings. The camp is structured with almost geometric precision, rows of tents or temporary shelters arranged in predictable spacing. There is little chaos here. Even rest appears scheduled. Movement is efficient, deliberate, and quiet. A curious footnote suggests that some soldiers personalize their equipment with small carvings or markings, despite regulations discouraging individuality. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether these markings were acts of subtle identity preservation or simply practical identifiers in large formations. As you continue, you observe training exercises taking place in open ground. Commands are short, sharp, and immediately followed. The emphasis is not on individual skill, but on coordinated response. A unit moves as one body, adjusting formation with mechanical precision. Your mind drifts through how this kind of discipline is not built in a day, but shaped through repetition over long periods. Records confirm that Qin military organization was structured into hierarchical units with clear chains of command, linking small groups to larger formations. A council decree proves that performance evaluation was based on measurable outcomes such as discipline adherence to orders and effectiveness in execution. Historians still argue whether this system reduced battlefield uncertainty or suppressed individual initiative too heavily. You notice supply wagons being loaded with grain and equipment. Everything is accounted for. Even the simplest item is recorded before departure. The logistical system feels almost invisible in its efficiency, yet it underpins everything you see. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes soldiers reportedly developing an instinct for marching rhythm so strong that they could maintain synchronized pace even without verbal commands. Oddly enough, scholars debate whether this reflects actual training intensity or later symbolic exaggeration of discipline. You move closer to a weapons inspection area. Crossbows are tested, arrowheads examined, and armor plates checked for durability. The attention to detail is striking. Nothing is left to chance. Each piece of equipment must meet defined standards before approval. Records confirm that crossbows were a significant technological advancement in this period, allowing greater range and consistency in battle. A council decree proves that weapon production was closely monitored to ensure reliability and uniformity across units. Your thoughts drift through how this system transforms warfare into something standardized, almost industrial in nature. Individual skill still matters, but it operates within tightly controlled frameworks. You pass a group of officers discussing deployment routes. Maps are simple but structured, relying on standardized measurements and known routes. Communication between units is maintained through messengers who travel continuously between positions. A curious footnote suggests that some military messengers developed extraordinary familiarity with terrain, reportedly memorizing entire routes after a single passage. Scholars still argue whether this reflects exceptional human memory or later storytelling embellishment. As you walk further, you begin to notice how the presence of soldiers affects surrounding settlements. Villages near military routes appear more regulated, their resources more closely managed. This proximity brings both protection and obligation. Records confirm that military supply networks often relied on surrounding agricultural regions for provisions, creating an interconnected relationship between rural production and military operations. This system ensures continuity but also increases pressure on local economies. A council decree proves that frontier regions were prioritized for military provisioning due to their strategic importance. Historians still argue whether this emphasis strengthened border security or overextended rural supply chains. You observe soldiers resting briefly between drills. Conversations are minimal but steady. There is a sense of shared condition rather than individual expression. Time here is structured around orders, not personal choice. A strange anecdote describes soldiers reportedly developing shared slang terms unique to specific units despite official standardization of language. Oddly enough, scholars debate whether this reflects natural social adaptation or resistance to linguistic control. You continue moving and begin to notice how deeply the military system is tied to infrastructure. Roads, supply stations, and inspection posts are all designed to support movement and coordination. The empire is not only defending itself, it is continuously preparing itself. Your mind drifts through the realization that this system depends on constant readiness. There is no true pause, only cycles of preparation and deployment. As the light begins to fade, campfires are lit across the staging ground. The glow spreads in organized clusters, marking the presence of thousands of coordinated lives temporarily gathered in one place. You realize that in this world, the soldier is not just a fighter. He is part of a structured network, moving through roles assigned long before he arrives at any battlefield. And as you stand at the edge of the camp, watching disciplined movement settle into evening stillness, you begin to understand that even rest here is part of the system's design. You leave the military staging grounds behind, and the road opens into something broader, more ambitious in its intent. The terrain is no longer just connecting villages and camps. It is binding the empire together like a carefully tightened frame. The surface beneath your feet is compacted and straightened, showing clear signs of deliberate construction rather than natural formation. Every stretch of road feels like a decision made by distant authority and enforced across thousands of miles. Records confirm that after unification, the Qin state invested heavily in standardized road systems designed for military movement, administration, and rapid communication. A council decree proves that road widths were regulated so that imperial carts could travel without obstruction across the entire network. Your mind drifts through this idea of enforced compatibility, where even movement must conform to design. You walk along a newly maintained section of road where workers are still visible in the distance, reinforcing edges with stone and packed soil. The labor is quiet but constant. There is no sense of improvisation here, only maintenance of an already established order. A curious footnote suggests that some local communities believed certain straight roads were drawn by heaven itself, because their uniformity seemed too precise to be entirely human. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether this reflects awe at engineering or later mythologizing of imperial infrastructure. As you continue, you notice relay stations positioned at regular intervals. These stations serve as points of rest exchange and communication. Officials move between them, carrying documents, messages, and instructions that ensure the empire remains synchronized across vast distances. Records confirm that courier systems were an essential part of Qin administration, allowing rapid transmission of orders from the capital to remote regions. A council decree proves that messengers were required to follow strict routes and reporting procedures, ensuring that information flowed without distortion. Your thoughts drift through how this system transforms distance itself. In earlier times, distance meant separation. Here, distance becomes manageable through structure. The empire reduces uncertainty by controlling movement. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes couriers reportedly memorizing sequences of landmarks so precisely that they could travel in poor visibility without hesitation. Scholars still argue whether this reflects trained discipline or narrative exaggeration of imperial efficiency. You pass a junction where multiple roads intersect. The design is deliberate, forming a network rather than isolated paths. Movement here is not random. It is channeled. Even choice of direction feels guided by prior planning. Records confirm that road networks were integrated with administrative centers, allowing officials to travel efficiently between commanderies and counties. A council decree proves that infrastructure development was considered a state priority directly linked to governance effectiveness. You notice how travel time itself becomes predictable. Distances are measured in standardized units, not just physical space but administrative expectation. This creates a sense of order that extends beyond geography. A curious footnote suggests that some travelers kept personal journey marks, small notations or carvings, along lesser-used paths to track emotional significance of travel points, though scholars still debate whether such practices were widespread or symbolic interpretations of later historians. As you move further along the road, you begin to encounter more structured commerce. Small stalls appear near junctions, offering goods to travelers and officials. Prices and measurements are standardized, reflecting broader imperial regulation of trade. Records confirm that the Qin state implemented unified measurement systems for weight, volume, and currency. A council decree proves that this standardization was intended to reduce regional inconsistency and improve economic integration across the empire. Your mind drifts through how this changes everyday exchange. Trade becomes more predictable, but also more controlled. There is less room for variation, less ambiguity in value. A strange anecdote describes merchants allegedly keeping hidden pre-unification measuring tools as personal heirlooms, even after official systems replaced them. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether this reflects resistance to standardization or simple sentimental attachment. You continue walking and notice how the road feels increasingly alive with movement. Soldiers, merchants, officials, and laborers all share the same infrastructure, each contributing to the flow of the empire. The road becomes a shared space of obligation and exchange. Records confirm that infrastructure projects were often maintained through corvée labor, requiring seasonal contributions from rural populations. A council decree proves that labor obligations were distributed according to household capacity and regional demand. You begin to feel how deeply interconnected this system is. Roads support administration. Administration supports taxation. Taxation supports military and infrastructure expansion. Everything loops back into itself. A curious footnote suggests that some villages developed informal rest shelters, along roads maintained collectively without official recognition, serving as quiet support points for travelers. Scholars still argue whether these were tolerated unofficially or simply overlooked by authorities. As the afternoon light shifts, you pass another relay station where officials are exchanging documents. The process is quick, almost routine, yet it represents the lifeblood of imperial coordination. Information moves continuously, binding distant regions into a single administrative rhythm. Your thoughts drift through the realization that in this system, efficiency is not just a goal, it is a form of control. Predictability replaces uncertainty, and movement itself becomes governed. As you pause briefly beside the road, watching carts disappear into the distance, you begin to understand that these roads are not just pathways. They are expressions of imperial intention made visible on the land itself. And as evening begins to settle across the horizon, the empire feels less like a collection of places and more like a single continuous motion stretching beyond sight. You continue along the imperial road, and the sense of movement gradually shifts from physical travel into something more abstract, as if the empire is now expressed not just in land and labor, but in numbers, symbols, and shared standards that quietly govern everything you see. The air feels lighter here, but the structure behind it feels even more precise. Records confirm that after unification, the Qin state implemented standardized systems for currency weights and measures across all commanderies. A council decree proves that these standards were enforced to eliminate regional variation and ensure consistent trade and taxation practices. Your mind drifts through the implications of this, where even value itself becomes something defined by the state. You arrive at a small market junction where merchants are arranging goods in carefully measured portions. Bronze coins with square central holes are exchanged with calm efficiency. The uniformity is striking. No matter where you look, the same shapes, the same weights, the same expectations repeat themselves. A curious footnote suggests that some older traders initially resisted the new coinage system, preferring local barter or older tokens, though scholars still argue whether this resistance was widespread or limited to isolated regions, adapting slowly to change. As you observe more closely, you notice weighing stations placed at intervals near the market. Officials verify transactions using standardized weights made of bronze or stone. Everything is checked against official references. There is little room for interpretation here, only alignment or correction. Records confirm that standardized measurement systems were crucial for integrating diverse regional economies into a unified imperial structure. A council decree proves that discrepancies in measurement were treated as administrative issues, not just economic irregularities. Your thoughts drift through how this transforms daily life. A transaction is no longer just an exchange between two individuals. It is an interaction mediated by a shared system of value that exists beyond them both. You watch as a merchant carefully divides grain into equal portions using marked containers. The precision is almost ritualistic. Each measurement must match expectation. Even slight deviation could lead to scrutiny. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes merchants allegedly developing memory scales, mentally visualizing weights to double-check official instruments, though scholars debate whether this reflects practical habit or later embellishment of merchant ingenuity. You continue walking and begin to see how deeply measurement extends into other aspects of life. Road distances are marked in standardized units. Agricultural yields are recorded in uniform quantities. Even administrative reporting follows consistent numerical frameworks. Records confirm that the Qin state's emphasis on standardization was not limited to currency, but extended across communication logistics and governance. A council decree proves that consistency was considered essential for maintaining control over vast territories. Your mind drifts through how this system reduces ambiguity. Everything becomes comparable, transferable, and recordable, but in doing so, it also reduces local variation and informal flexibility. A curious footnote suggests that some rural communities maintained unofficial household measures for cooking and daily use, even while complying with official standards during inspections. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether this reflects cultural persistence or practical adaptation. As you move further through the market area, you notice how trade flows more smoothly than in fragmented regions. Goods from distant areas appear alongside local products. The standardization of currency and measurement allows for broader exchange networks to function efficiently. Records confirm that this economic integration supported both civilian supply chains and military provisioning. A council decree proves that standardized systems were essential for rapid mobilization of resources during campaigns. You observe officials recording transactions in bamboo ledgers. Each entry is precise, structured, and verifiable. The act of writing becomes a form of economic control, ensuring that every exchange leaves a trace. A strange anecdote describes a clerk who reportedly could detect inconsistencies in accounts simply by rereading them aloud, though. Scholars still debate whether this reflects skill training or later narrative idealization of bureaucratic accuracy. You begin to notice how language itself is shaped by this system. Standard terms for goods, weights, and values appear repeatedly in conversations. Communication becomes more uniform, reducing misunderstandings, but also limiting variation in expression. Records confirm that linguistic standardization was encouraged alongside measurement systems to improve administrative efficiency. A council decree proves that consistency in terminology was seen as essential for governance across diverse regions. Your thoughts drift through how deeply this reaches into identity. Even everyday speech becomes part of a larger framework of control and clarity. A curious footnote suggests that some merchants developed informal storytelling methods to remember pricing structures, embedding numbers into rhymes or phrases for easier recall. Scholars still argue whether this reflects cognitive adaptation or cultural creativity. As the market begins to quiet in the late afternoon, you notice how quickly goods are packed away and accounts finalized. The rhythm of trade is tightly bound to official oversight. Nothing remains open-ended for long. You realize that in this world, value is not just discovered, it is defined. It is measured, recorded, and standardized until it becomes stable enough to govern across vast distances. And as you stand at the edge of the market, watching the last coins change hands, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even worth itself is something the state teaches the world to recognize. You leave the market's structured rhythm behind, and the world shifts again, this time into something quieter, but more profound, as if the empire has moved from controlling movement and value to controlling meaning itself. The road narrows slightly, passing through areas where writing becomes more visible than trade, more present than agriculture, as though the land itself is learning to speak in standardized symbols. Records confirm that after unification, the Qin state standardized written script across its territories, replacing regional variations with a unified system known as small seal script. A council decree proves that this reform was intended to improve administrative clarity and prevent miscommunication between regions. Your mind drifts through the impact of this, where language itself becomes a tool of cohesion. You enter a small administrative courtyard where scribes are working in steady silence. The sound of brushes moving across bamboo slips is soft but continuous, like rainfall that never quite stops. Each character is carefully formed, consistent in shape, reflecting not personal style, but institutional requirement. A curious footnote suggests that some early scribes believed writing standardized by the state carried a kind of official weight, as if characters themselves became heavier when used in administrative contexts. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether this reflects symbolic interpretation or early awareness of writing's psychological authority. As you observe more closely, you notice how writing is not just communication here. It is control memory and verification all at once. Every transaction, every order, every report is fixed into written form before it can be acted upon. Nothing remains purely spoken or temporary. Records confirm that scribes were trained extensively to reproduce characters with precision, ensuring consistency across regions. A council decree proves that errors in documentation could result in serious administrative consequences, reinforcing the importance of accuracy over speed. Your thoughts drift through how this transforms knowledge itself. Information is no longer fluid or localized. It becomes stored, transported, and replicated across vast distances without change. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes scribes reportedly comparing handwriting strokes for hours to ensure absolute uniformity, though scholars debate whether this reflects historical practice or later exaggeration of bureaucratic discipline. You continue walking and begin to notice how writing appears everywhere now, on official notices, on seals, on boundary markers, even on storage containers. The written word has expanded beyond documents into physical space itself. Records confirm that standardization of script was a key part of Qin administrative reform, allowing officials from different regions to communicate effectively. A council decree proves that this reform was considered essential for unifying governance across culturally diverse territories. Your mind drifts through the idea that writing here is not merely descriptive, it is prescriptive. It defines what something is and how it should be understood. A curious footnote suggests that some rural communities initially treated official documents as objects of ritual respect, placing them in elevated positions or covering them when not in use. Scholars still argue whether this reflects reverence, fear, or practical caution. As you move further along the path, you encounter a group of traveling officials carrying bamboo scrolls sealed with lacquered stamps. The seals are as important as the text itself, functioning as verification of authority. Without them, writing is incomplete. Records confirm that sealing practices were strictly regulated to prevent forgery and ensure authenticity. A council decree proves that only authorized officials could issue certain types of documents, reinforcing centralized control over information flow. Your thoughts drift through how this system creates layers of validation. Writing must be correct, sealed and registered before it becomes actionable. Nothing exists independently of verification. A strange anecdote describes a case where a missing seal reportedly halted an entire administrative process for days, though scholars still debate whether this reflects procedural rigidity or later storytelling meant to emphasize bureaucratic precision. You continue onward and begin to see how literacy itself becomes a form of power. Those who can read and write hold access to administrative systems that shape taxation, law, and movement. This creates a subtle but important divide within society. Records confirm that scribes and clerks were often selected through training and examination of writing ability. A council decree proves that administrative literacy was increasingly tied to career advancement within the imperial system. Your mind drifts through how this changes the structure of influence. Authority is no longer only about land or lineage. It is also about access to written systems that govern daily life. A curious footnote suggests that some villagers memorized common official phrases to navigate interactions with bureaucrats, even if they could not read fully. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether this reflects adaptation to exclusion or early forms of informal literacy. As you pass another courtyard, you notice children practicing writing strokes on wooden boards. Their movements are slow and deliberate, shaped by repetition. Education here is closely tied to administrative expectation. Records confirm that writing instruction became increasingly standardized in Qin territories, reinforcing uniform communication across regions. A council decree proves that proper script formation was considered essential for future administrative participation. Your thoughts drift through how deeply this system embeds itself into identity. To write correctly is to belong to the structure. To deviate is to stand outside it. As the light shifts toward evening, you realize that the empire has extended its reach beyond land and labor into thought itself, shaping how information is formed, recorded, and preserved. And as you stand in the quiet courtyard, watching the final brushstrokes of the day dry on bamboo slips, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even language is part of governance. You leave the writing courtyards behind, and the air begins to change again, this time carrying the mixed scent of spices, raw goods, and human movement. The empire opens into a busier rhythm once more, but now it is not the rhythm of fields or administration. It is the rhythm of exchange. You are entering a marketplace, but one that no longer feels entirely local. It feels supervised, structured, and quietly watched. Records confirm that under Qin rule markets were subject to increasing regulation, including standardized pricing systems and official oversight of trade practices. A council decree proves that merchants were required to use approved weights, measures, and currency during transactions. Your mind drifts through how even commerce, something that once felt spontaneous, is now carefully bounded by imperial expectation. You walk through rows of stalls where goods are arranged with surprising discipline. Grain is stacked in measured bundles. Cloth is folded into uniform lengths. Metal tools are displayed in ordered groups rather than scattered variety. There is still color and movement, but it is channeled, not chaotic. A curious footnote suggests that some merchants arranged goods in patterns meant to attract buyers while still complying with inspection standards, blending visual appeal with administrative conformity. Oddly enough, Scholars still argue whether this reflects creativity under constraint or subtle adaptation to regulation. As you move deeper into the market, you notice officials stationed at intervals. They are not aggressive, but their presence is constant. They inspect weights, verify seals, and occasionally check written records. Their role is not to interrupt trade, but to ensure it remains aligned with the system. Records confirm that market supervision was part of broader Qin efforts to stabilize economic activity and prevent regional disparities in pricing. A council decree proves that unfair measurement or fraudulent trade practices were punishable under formal law, reinforcing trust in standardized exchange. Your thoughts drift through how this changes the experience of buying and selling. Transactions are no longer purely personal agreements. They are mediated interactions within a larger regulatory framework. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes merchants allegedly developing subtle hand signals to communicate pricing adjustments discreetly, though scholars still debate whether this reflects historical practice or later imaginative reconstruction of market behavior. You continue walking and notice how goods from distant regions appear alongside local products. Salt, grain, cloth, and metal tools circulate through networks that stretch far beyond the immediate area. The market is not just a local hub, it is a node, an imperial system. Records confirm that improved road infrastructure and standardized currency facilitated long-distance trade during the Qin period. A council decree proves that the state actively supported logistical networks that enabled efficient movement of goods across commanderies. Your mind drifts through the realization that distance is becoming less significant in economic terms. What matters now is compliance with shared systems of measurement and value. A curious footnote suggests that some rural traders initially struggled to adapt to standardized pricing, sometimes rounding values in familiar ways before adjusting to official systems. Scholars still argue whether this reflects resistance or simple transitional confusion. As you approach another section of the market, you notice artisans at work. Metal tools are being repaired, pottery shaped, and textiles woven with consistent techniques. Production here is not isolated from regulation. Even craftsmanship operates within exacted standards. Records confirm that artisan production was often linked to state demand, especially for tools, weapons, and infrastructure materials. A council decree proves that certain goods were produced under official quotas to meet administrative and military needs. Your thoughts drift through how this intertwines creativity with obligation. Even skilled labor is not entirely independent. It serves both local needs and imperial systems. A strange anecdote describes artisans allegedly developing signature decorative motifs within permitted boundaries, subtly expressing identity while still complying with standardization rules. Oddly enough, scholars still debate whether this reflects artistic resistance or simply variation within regulation. You continue through the market and notice how interactions remain polite but efficient. There is little bargaining in the traditional sense. Prices are often already aligned with expected standards, leaving limited room for negotiation. Records confirm that market regulation aimed to reduce price volatility and ensure fairness across regions. A council decree proves that stability in trade was considered essential for maintaining broader economic order. Your mind drifts through how this stability comes at a cost. Predictability replaces spontaneity. Security replaces unpredictability. The system favors consistency over fluctuation. A curious footnote suggests that some merchants quietly traveled between regions to exploit minor differences in supply availability, though scholars still argue whether this reflects entrepreneurial adaptation or regulatory loopholes. As evening approaches, the market begins to thin. Stalls are closed, goods are packed, and officials complete final inspections. The rhythm of commerce slows but does not disappear. It simply transitions into storage and accounting. You realize that the marketplace is not just a place of exchange. It is a controlled interface between production and governance, where every transaction contributes to a larger administrative picture. And as you stand at the edge of the fading market light, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even trade is not free movement, but carefully guided flow. You leave the regulated market behind, and the noise of exchange fades into something more intimate and enclosed. The path narrows again, passing between courtyards and small domestic compounds where daily life unfolds in quieter, less publicly observed rhythms. Yet even here, the Qin system does not disappear. It simply becomes less visible, woven into roles, expectations, and the structure of the household itself. Records confirm that women in Qin society were legally integrated into the household registration system, meaning their identities were recorded as part of family units responsible for taxation and labor obligations. A council decree proves that household stability depended on clearly defined roles, with each member contributing in specific ways to survival and state requirements. Your mind drifts through this structure where private life and public duty are not separate spheres, but overlapping ones. You pass a courtyard where women are working with textiles, spinning thread, and weaving cloth with steady, practiced motions. The rhythm is repetitive but not mindless. It carries experience, memory, and shared knowledge passed through generations. Smoke from nearby cooking fires drifts through the air, blending domestic scent with the faint dryness of grain storage. A curious footnote suggests that some women subtly encoded family patterns or symbolic motifs into textile designs, even when producing standardized cloth for official quotas. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether these designs were intentional expressions of identity or simply aesthetic variation within practical production. As you observe more closely, you begin to see how household labor is structured around both necessity and obligation. Cloth production is not only for family use, but often part of tax requirements. Grain preparation, weaving, and maintenance of domestic supplies all contribute to broader state expectations. Records confirm that households were responsible for producing a portion of their own textile goods as part of tax obligations. A council decree proves that surplus production could be collected or redistributed through official channels, reinforcing the link between domestic labor and imperial supply systems. Your thoughts drift through how deeply this integrates private life into administrative frameworks. Even the most personal spaces are not fully detached from state structure. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes households reportedly timing weaving cycles according to seasonal inspection patterns, though scholars still debate whether this reflects adaptive planning or later interpretive storytelling. You continue walking and notice how children move through these spaces as part of ongoing labor rhythms. They assist with small tasks, learning skills that will eventually become obligations. There is no strict separation between play and preparation. Life flows continuously into responsibility. Records confirm that early training in household skills was considered essential for maintaining economic stability. A council decree proves that families were expected to ensure all members contributed appropriately according to age and ability. Your mind drifts through how identity here is shaped not only by law, but by function. Each person occupies a role that is both social and administrative. A curious footnote suggests that some households maintained informal storytelling traditions during evening work, sharing local histories or myths while completing repetitive tasks. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether these stories served purely entertainment purposes or also reinforced communal cohesion under structured labor conditions. As you move deeper into the residential area, you notice subtle variations in household structure. Some compounds are slightly larger, indicating higher status or greater resource allocation, while others are modest and tightly organized. Yet all remain part of the same administrative framework. Records confirm that household classification influenced tax obligations and labor requirements, creating graded responsibilities across society. A council decree proves that registration systems were periodically updated to reflect changes in population and productivity. Your thoughts drift through how this system maintains order through categorization. Everyone is accounted for, but not everyone is equal in obligation. A strange anecdote describes villagers allegedly comparing household registration statuses during communal gatherings, though scholars still debate whether this reflects social awareness of hierarchy or later narrative framing. You pause near a storage area where grain jars and tools are carefully arranged. The organization is precise, reflecting both practicality and expectation. Even storage becomes a reflection of administrative discipline. Records confirm that households were expected to maintain readiness for inspection, ensuring that goods, tools, and supplies matched official records. A council decree proves that discrepancies between declared and observed resources could result in penalties. Your mind drifts through how this creates a constant awareness of potential oversight. Even in absence of officials, behavior remains shaped by the possibility of inspection. A curious footnote suggests that some families subtly rearranged household items temporarily during inspection periods, then returned them to functional arrangements afterward. Scholars still argue whether this reflects deception adaptation or simple practical management of expectations. As evening begins to settle, you observe families gathering for meals. The atmosphere is quiet but cohesive. Food is shared, tasks are discussed, and plans for the next day are prepared. Life continues within structure, but also within familiar human rhythms. You realize that in this world, the household is not merely a private space. It is a unit of governance, a point where state expectation and daily life meet and overlap. And as you stand at the edge of the courtyard, watching the glow of cooking fires deepen into night, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even family life is part of a larger system of order. You leave the glow of household fires behind, and the night air feels slightly cooler as you move into quieter residential lanes. The sounds of the day fade into softer echoes, replaced by occasional footsteps, distant voices, and the gentle settling of a community preparing for rest. Yet even in this quieter moment, the Qin system does not loosen its presence. It simply becomes less visible, embedded in habits formed over years of expectation. Records confirm that childhood in the Qin Empire was closely tied to household labor and early preparation for state obligations. A council decree proves that families were responsible for ensuring children learned basic skills necessary for agricultural, textile, or administrative support roles. Your mind drifts through this structure, where growing up is not separate from contributing. You pass a small courtyard where children are gathered near an elder, listening while practicing simple tasks. Their movements are careful but still playful in tone, as if learning is woven into daily rhythm rather than separated into formal instruction. The air carries the scent of cooked grain and wood smoke, softening the edges of discipline with familiarity. A curious footnote suggests that some children were taught counting using grain kernels or pebbles, linking numerical understanding directly to agricultural life. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether this reflects structured pedagogy or organic development of practical knowledge within rural households. As you continue walking, you notice how early responsibility shapes behavior. Children assist with fetching water, sorting materials, or helping in fields during lighter tasks. Records confirm that labor participation began early in life, reinforcing both skill development and household contribution. Your thoughts drift through how this creates a seamless transition from childhood into structured adulthood. There is no sharp boundary, only gradual accumulation of responsibility. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes children reportedly imitating official inspection routines during play, mimicking measurement and record-keeping behaviors observed in adults. Scholars still debate whether this reflects cultural transmission or later interpretive storytelling about administrative influence. You move further along the lane and notice how education is not formalized in the modern sense, but deeply practical. Knowledge is acquired through observation, repetition, and participation in daily tasks. Writing skills, when present, are tied directly to administrative necessity rather than abstract learning. Records confirm that literacy was primarily developed for clerical and administrative purposes during this period. A council decree proves that individuals with writing ability often held roles related to documentation, taxation, or record-keeping, reinforcing the connection between literacy and governance. Your mind drifts through how this shapes perception. Knowledge is not neutral. It is functional, linked to role and responsibility. A curious footnote suggests that some households pass down informal mnemonic techniques to help younger members remember official terms or measurement standards, though scholars still argue whether this reflects adaptive learning or unofficial educational systems. As you walk, you pass by homes where older children are already assisting in more structured labor tasks. They carry tools, organize materials, or help prepare goods for storage. There is a quiet sense of continuity in how roles develop over time. Records confirm that age-based labor expectations were integrated into household planning, ensuring that productivity was maintained across generations. A council decree proves that families were expected to allocate tasks according to capability, reinforcing efficiency within domestic units. Your thoughts drift through how this system balances necessity with structure. It ensures survival but also defines the shape of daily life from early years onward. A strange anecdote describes adolescents reportedly forming small cooperative groups to complete shared tasks more efficiently, though scholars still debate whether this reflects natural social organization or later romanticized accounts of rural solidarity. You continue through the settlement and notice how evenings are structured around both rest and preparation. Tools are repaired, supplies are arranged, plans for the next day are quietly discussed. There is no true separation between ending and beginning. Records confirm that household efficiency was essential for maintaining agricultural productivity and meeting state obligations. A council decree proves that disruptions in household output could affect broader tax and supply systems. Your mind drifts through how deeply interconnected individual households are with imperial stability. Every small action contributes to a larger structure, whether consciously or not. A curious footnote suggests that some families used subtle visual markers, such as arrangements of household objects, to track seasonal cycles and inspection periods. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether this reflects environmental adaptation or administrative awareness embedded in daily life. As night deepens, you notice how sounds diminish but do not disappear entirely. Soft conversations continue. Occasional footsteps pass through lanes. Life does not fully pause. It simply lowers its volume. You realize that childhood here is not a separate phase of innocence detached from structure. It is part of the same continuum that shapes adulthood labor and obligation. And as you stand quietly at the edge of the settlement, watching lantern light flicker through earthen walls, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even growing up follows the rhythm of order. You leave the settled courtyards of childhood behind, and the landscape opens into something quieter, more reflective, as if the empire itself briefly exhales. The night is deeper now. Lantern light flickers in small clusters along pathways, and the scent of burning resin and dried herbs drifts through the air. Even here, where daily labor pauses, the Qin world does not truly soften. It simply changes form. Records confirm that local religious practice during the Qin period was highly varied, blending older folk traditions with emerging state influences. A council decree proves that certain ritual practices were monitored or regulated when they intersected with public order or official ceremonies. Your mind drifts through this layered spiritual landscape where belief is both personal and subtly observed. You pass a small shrine at the edge of a village. It is modest built from wood and stone, decorated with simple offerings of grain cloth and dried plants. There is no grand temple here, no towering structure. Instead, there is intimacy, a quiet negotiation between people and unseen forces. A curious footnote suggests that some villagers believed household spirits could influence agricultural success, particularly during planting and harvest seasons. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether this reflects genuine spiritual systems or symbolic expressions of environmental uncertainty. As you stand near the shrine, you notice how ritual is woven into daily life, rather than separated from it. Offerings are placed carefully, not with spectacle, but with quiet intention. The boundary between routine and reverence feels thin, almost transparent. Records confirm that ancestral reverence played an important role in household practice, with families maintaining offerings for deceased relatives as part of ongoing social and emotional continuity. A council decree proves that such practices were generally permitted as long as they did not disrupt administrative obligations or public order. Your thoughts drift through how memory itself becomes structured here. The past is not distant. It is actively maintained through ritual gestures, repeated actions, and shared acknowledgement. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes families reportedly leaving small portions of meals untouched as symbolic offerings during difficult seasons, though scholars still debate whether this reflects widespread custom or localized interpretation of ritual practice. You continue walking and notice how quiet the village becomes at night. Yet even in silence, there is a sense of presence. Lamps remain lit in some homes, suggesting continued activity or reflection. The world does not fully sleep. It simply transitions into a slower rhythm. Records confirm that ritual practices often coincided with agricultural cycles, aligning spiritual observances with planting growth and harvest periods. A council decree proves that certain official ceremonies were conducted to reinforce imperial legitimacy and cosmic order. Your mind drifts through how belief and governance overlap subtly in this world. While personal rituals vary, state ceremonies provide structure, creating shared moments of recognition across regions. A curious footnote suggests that some communities interpreted unusual weather patterns as signs requiring additional offerings or communal reflection, though scholars still argue whether this reflects structured belief systems or adaptive responses to environmental unpredictability. As you move further, you encounter a small group gathered quietly in conversation near a lantern. Their voices are low, their gestures restrained. The discussion appears informal, yet it carries the weight of shared understanding. Stories are exchanged, memories recalled, and local events interpreted through familiar frameworks. Records confirm that oral tradition remained an important part of cultural life, even as written administration expanded. A council decree proves that spoken customs were not eliminated, but existed alongside formal systems, creating a layered cultural environment. Your thoughts drift through how knowledge here is not confined to writing alone. It exists in memory speech and repetition carried through generations in both formal and informal ways. A strange anecdote describes villagers reportedly interpreting eclipses or unusual natural phenomena through communal storytelling, though scholars still debate whether this reflects widespread belief or later narrative reconstruction of ancient perception. You continue along the path and notice how the night air feels heavier with stillness. Sounds are fewer now. Movement is minimal, yet life continues in quiet continuity beneath the surface of darkness. Records confirm that seasonal rituals often serve to reinforce community cohesion during transitional periods in agricultural cycles. A council decree proves that such observances were sometimes coordinated with administrative calendars to align local and state structures. Your mind drifts through how this alignment creates a subtle synchronization between human rhythm and imperial structure. Even belief is not entirely separate from governance. A curious footnote suggests that some households maintained private ritual spaces within their homes, distinct from official shrines, though scholars still argue whether this reflects personal devotion or spatial organization of household life. As you stand near the edge of the village, again looking back at faint lantern light, you realize that belief here is not loud or centralized. It is distributed, quiet, and deeply embedded in everyday life. And as the night settles fully around you, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even what cannot be seen is gently shaped by structure. You leave the soft glow of village rituals behind, and the night feels deeper now, as if the world has narrowed into silence and thought. The road under your feet is barely visible, yet still present, still guiding you forward. Even in darkness, the Qin Empire does not disappear. It simply becomes less audible, like a system continuing to function while no one is actively watching it. Records confirm that belief in omens and unusual natural events remained widespread during the Qin period, even as administrative rationalization expanded. A council decree proves that reports of extraordinary signs were sometimes recorded by officials, especially when they coincided with political or military events. Your mind drifts through this intersection of observation and interpretation where nature is never entirely neutral. You notice a faint rustling in the fields nearby, caused by wind moving through dry stalks. In another context, it would be ordinary. Here it feels slightly charged, as if every unusual sound might be noticed, recorded, or remembered. A curious footnote suggests that some villagers interpreted sudden animal movements or atmospheric shifts as signals requiring reflection or adjustment in behavior. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether these interpretations were systematic belief structures or retrospective meanings assigned by later historians. As you continue walking, you recall how deeply the Qin world relies on structured interpretation of reality. Even events that seem spontaneous are often placed within frameworks of meaning. Records confirm that unusual occurrences were sometimes documented by officials when they intersected with governance or military planning. A council decree proves that state attention to signs and irregularities was not purely spiritual, but also administrative, ensuring that unexpected events were tracked in case they indicated larger patterns affecting stability. Your thoughts drift through how observation itself becomes part of governance. You pass a small open clearing where the sky is visible in fragments between clouds. The stars are faint but steady. In earlier eras, such moments might have been purely contemplative. Here, even the sky feels indirectly connected to structure as people interpret it through layered systems of meaning. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes villagers reportedly associating unusual celestial patterns with shifts in imperial fortune, though scholars still debate whether this reflects genuine belief or later narrative framing of political symbolism. You move further along the road and begin to notice how memory and interpretation shape experience. People do not simply see events, they contextualize them within shared understanding, often blending observation with inherited explanation. Records confirm that officials sometimes recorded reports of unusual phenomena alongside administrative data, particularly when they coincided with significant transitions or events. A council decree proves that such records were archived for reference, reflecting an early integration of observation into governance. Your mind drifts through how this system does not separate natural and administrative reality. Everything can be interpreted through structured lenses, even uncertainty itself. A curious footnote suggests that some local communities maintained informal interpretation elders who specialized in explaining unusual events through traditional frameworks, though scholars still argue whether these roles were formalized or simply socially recognized. As you continue, the night grows quieter again. The earlier tension of interpretation softens into stillness, yet your awareness of observation remains. It is as if the act of noticing has itself become meaningful. Records confirm that the Qin system increasingly relied on detailed reporting from local levels to central authorities, ensuring that information about both ordinary and unusual events flowed upward through administrative channels. A council decree proves that accuracy in reporting was considered essential for maintaining stability. Your thoughts drift through how this creates a world where even randomness is processed through structure. Nothing is left entirely unexamined. A strange anecdote describes travelers reportedly altering their routes after hearing rumors of unusual natural events along certain paths, though scholars still debate whether this reflects superstition, caution, or practical risk assessment. You walk further and notice how your own perception begins to shift. Even simple sounds like wind or distant movement feel slightly more significant than before, not because they are inherently different, but because you are now aware of how meaning is assigned in this world. Records confirm that communication systems within the Qin Empire often included reports of environmental conditions alongside logistical information, particularly for military and agricultural planning. A council decree proves that such integration improved responsiveness to changing conditions. Your mind drifts through how observation becomes layered: what is seen, what is recorded, and what is interpreted. All exist simultaneously, shaping decisions at multiple levels. A curious footnote suggests that some individuals developed personal habits of mentally categorizing unusual events into ordinary and notable memory groups, though scholars still argue whether this reflects cognitive adaptation or cultural conditioning. As the night deepens further, you realize that the world around you has not changed. Your perception of it has. The same fields, the same roads, the same sky now feel subtly organized through awareness of interpretation and record. And as you pause for a moment in the darkness, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even what feels uncertain is quietly folded into systems of meaning. You leave the quiet weight of night observations behind, and the landscape begins to shift again, this time into something more monumental, as if the darkness itself is revealing the outlines of structures built for purposes larger than daily life. The road rises gently, and the wind feels less rural, more exposed, carrying the faint echo of distant labor even in the stillness. Records confirm that during the Qin period, extensive defensive construction projects began along northern frontiers, forming early versions of what would later be associated with the Great Wall system. A council decree proves that these works relied heavily on organized labor conscription, drawing workers from multiple regions under centralized command. Your mind drifts through this immense undertaking where entire landscapes are reshaped through coordinated human effort. You walk along a section where stone foundations and packed earth ramparts emerge from the terrain like scars of deliberate intention. Even in partial darkness, the structure feels immense. It is not a single wall, but a series of connected defenses, watch points, and fortified segments extending beyond visible range. A curious footnote suggests that some workers believed the wall grew gradually, like a living boundary, expanding each season with renewed labor cycles. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether this reflects literal belief, metaphorical storytelling, or later romanticized interpretation of construction efforts. As you continue, you notice remnants of temporary work camps nearby. These are not permanent settlements, but shifting spaces of labor where workers rest, eat, and recover before continuing construction. The organization is simple, but strict, shaped by necessity and oversight. Records confirm that frontier construction served dual purposes: defense against external threats and internal integration of labor resources. A council decree proves that these projects were strategically prioritized to stabilize newly unified territories. Your thoughts drift through how labor itself becomes a form of movement across the empire. People are not only tied to land through agriculture or household obligations, but also mobilized into large-scale state projects. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes workers reportedly marking personal symbols on stones used in construction, perhaps as a way of leaving traceable identity within otherwise collective labor. Scholars still debate whether this reflects individual expression or practical record-keeping. You move along the edge of the structure and notice how terrain is carefully adapted. Hills are reinforced, valleys filled, and watch positions elevated. The design is not uniform in appearance, but unified in purpose. Records confirm that Qin defensive systems were integrated with communication routes, allowing signals to be transmitted across distances using visual or physical markers. A council decree proves that coordination between watch stations and administrative centers was essential for rapid response. Your mind drifts through the idea that this is not just a wall. It is a network of anticipation designed to observe and respond before events fully unfold. A curious footnote suggests that some frontier communities developed seasonal rhythms around construction cycles, adjusting agricultural and domestic routines to match labor deployment schedules, though scholars still argue whether this reflects adaptation or structural imposition. As you continue, you encounter scattered tools and remnants of ongoing work. Even in rest periods, the environment feels unfinished, always in transition. The sense of permanence is paradoxically created through continuous change. Records confirm that construction materials were standardized where possible, including earth compaction techniques and timber reinforcement. A council decree proves that consistency in building methods was considered essential for structural integrity across vast distances. Your thoughts drift through how this standardization mirrors earlier systems of measurement and script. The empire builds not only physically, but conceptually, aligning all forms of production toward coherence. A strange anecdote describes workers allegedly timing labor shifts based on signal fires or drum patterns, though scholars still debate whether this reflects actual coordination methods or later narrative simplification. You pause at a slightly elevated point and look outward. The structure stretches into the distance, disappearing into darkness and terrain. It feels less like a barrier and more like a continuous presence shaping how land's understood. Records confirm that frontier defenses were often supported by nearby agricultural settlements, ensuring supply and labor continuity. A council decree proves that these systems were interdependent, linking food production, labor organization, and military strategy. Your mind drifts through how deeply interconnected everything has become. Agriculture feeds construction. Construction supports defense. Defense stabilizes the empire that regulates agriculture. A curious footnote suggests that some workers reportedly developed a sense of ownership memory, remembering specific sections of construction they had worked on even when relocated, though. Scholars still argue whether this reflects emotional attachment or later interpretive framing. As night settles more fully, the structure becomes harder to distinguish from the landscape itself. It blends into hills and shadows, becoming part of the terrain rather than sitting upon it. You realize that what you are witnessing is not only defense against external forces, but also a physical expression of imperial organization across space. And as you stand quietly beside the partially visible ramparts, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, Even the land is shaped to remember structure. You leave the shadow of the frontier works behind, and the world feels slightly tighter again, as if the open scale of construction has been replaced by something more intimate, yet more psychologically pressing. The road returns you toward settled regions, but the sense of control does not loosen. Instead, it becomes more personal, more immediate, as if the empire is now closer to the skin of daily life. Records confirm that the Qin legal system imposed strict and clearly defined punishments for a wide range of offenses designed to ensure predictable enforcement rather than discretionary judgment. A council decree proves that penalties were standardized to maintain consistency across regions, reducing ambiguity in legal interpretation. Your mind drifts through this structure where justice is not debated but executed according to code. You pass a small administrative notice board where offenses and penalties are displayed in written form. The characters are precise, arranged in orderly columns. There is no emotional language here, only classification. The effect is quiet, but deeply unsettling, as if human behavior itself has been sorted into categories. A curious footnote suggests that some villagers reportedly memorized common penalties, not out of legal necessity, but as a form of mental preparedness, though scholars still argue whether this reflects caution, fear, or practical adaptation to a structured environment. As you continue walking, you notice how people behave in subtly careful ways. Movements are measured, conversations are restrained. Even greetings feel slightly formalized, as if everyone is aware that small actions can carry larger consequences. Records confirm that Qin governance relied on a system of collective responsibility where groups could be held accountable for unreported offenses. A council decree proves that this system was intended to encourage mutual oversight and reduce concealment of violations. Your thoughts drift through how this reshapes social relationships. Neighbors are no longer only companions. They are also informal observers of one another's conduct. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes villagers reportedly developing indirect ways of warning each other about possible inspection periods using subtle gestures or routine changes rather than spoken warnings. Oddly enough, scholars still debate whether this reflects widespread practice or isolated adaptation. You move through a settlement where officials are conducting inspections. The process is calm but absolute. Records are checked. Household conditions are verified. There is no visible confrontation, only structured evaluation. Records confirm that inspections were routine elements of administrative governance, ensuring compliance with tax, labor, and legal obligations. A council decree proves that accuracy in reporting was prioritized to maintain systemic stability. Your mind drifts through how this constant possibility of inspection shapes behavior even when no officials are present. Presence is no longer required for influence. A curious footnote suggests that some households temporarily rearrange stored goods or labor tools before inspection periods, then return them afterward, though scholars still argue whether this reflects deception, adaptation, or simple optimization of space. As you continue, you notice small penalties being enforced for minor infractions. The responses are consistent rather than emotional. There is no negotiation once a violation is identified. The system prioritizes clarity over flexibility. Records confirm that Qin legal philosophy emphasized predictability in enforcement to prevent inconsistent judgment. A council decree proves that officials were evaluated based on adherence to legal code rather than personal interpretation. Your thoughts drift through how this creates a world where uncertainty is reduced at the cost of spontaneity. People know the boundaries, but those boundaries are firmly drawn. A strange anecdote describes individuals reportedly adjusting daily routines to avoid even accidental violations, such as timing movements or transactions around known inspection cycles, though scholars still debate whether this reflects genuine behavioral adaptation or later narrative emphasis on legal strictness. You pass through a small gathering where community members are quietly discussing recent administrative changes. The conversation is subdued but attentive. Information flows through informal networks, even within a highly regulated system. Records confirm that local communication often supplemented official channels, allowing communities to interpret and adjust to legal expectations. A council decree proves that while information was standardized, its local understanding still required human mediation. Your mind drifts through this tension between structure and interpretation. Even within strict systems, people find ways to navigate complexity through shared understanding. A curious footnote suggests that some individuals became known locally for their familiarity with legal codes, acting as informal advisors within communities, though scholars still argue whether this reflects social necessity or emerging specialization. As evening approaches again, movement slows. The settlement settles into quieter rhythms, but the awareness of legal structure does not disappear. It lingers in habits, timing, and restraint. You realize that punishment here is not just a response to wrongdoing. It is part of a broader system that shapes behavior before action even occurs. And as you stand at the edge of the settlement, watching lights dim one by one, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire even discipline is designed to be felt before it is enforced. You leave behind the structured quiet of legal enforcement, and the landscape softens into something more familiar again, though not less shaped by the empire. The road leads you toward areas where daily life is defined less by inspection boards and penalties, and more by the simple, persistent rhythm of food labor and survival. The scent of smoke and boiling grain drifts through the air, grounding everything in something immediate and human. Records confirm that the Qin diet in rural regions was largely based on millet, supplemented by vegetables, beans, and occasional livestock products when available. A council decree proves that grain storage and distribution were closely monitored to ensure stability across regions. Your mind drifts through this reality where food is not abundance, but carefully managed continuity. You step into a small cooking area where families are preparing evening meals. Pots simmer over low fires. The sound is gentle, steady, almost meditative. Portions are simple, but consistent, shaped by what the land provides and what the system requires. A curious footnote suggests that some households developed regional variations of millet porridge, using locally gathered herbs and wild plants, though scholars still argue whether this reflects culinary creativity or necessity driven by scarcity and taxation demands. As you continue walking, you notice how food preparation is deeply tied to household structure. Meals are not individualistic, but shared within family units, reinforcing collective responsibility and resource management. Records confirm that agricultural production was carefully integrated into taxation systems, meaning that a portion of harvests was allocated to state granaries before local consumption. A council decree proves that surplus distribution was managed centrally to stabilize supply during shortages or military campaigns. Your thoughts drift through how this creates a delicate balance between sustenance and obligation. Food is both nourishment and contribution to a larger system. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes families reportedly marking storage jars with simple symbols to track which portions were designated for household use versus state collection, though scholars still debate whether this reflects practical organization or subtle resistance. You move through a small storage courtyard where grain is carefully stacked in sealed containers. The organization is precise, designed to minimize loss and ensure accountability. Even here, structure is visible in the arrangement of basic survival resources. Records confirm that state granaries played a critical role in stabilizing food supply across regions, especially during poor harvest years or military movements. A council decree proves that redistribution of stored grain was coordinated through administrative networks to prevent localized shortages. Your mind drifts through how food security here is not left to chance. It is constructed through systems of collection, storage, and redistribution that span the entire empire. A curious footnote suggests that some communities developed informal seasonal markers based on grain storage levels rather than calendar dates, though. Scholars still argue whether this reflects adaptation to state systems or traditional agricultural intuition. As you continue, you notice how even cooking practices reflect efficiency. Ingredients are used carefully. Waste is minimal. Every resource is treated as part of a larger cycle of use and replenishment. Records confirm that household production of textiles and food preparation were both tied to labor expectations, reinforcing the integration of domestic work into broader economic systems. A council decree proves that households were responsible for maintaining self-sufficiency while also contributing to state quotas. Your thoughts drift through how deeply embedded the empire is in something as basic as eating. Even meals are shaped by expectation and structure. A strange anecdote describes villagers reportedly adjusting cooking times based on inspection schedules or labor demands, though scholars still debate whether this reflects true practice or later narrative interpretation of administrative influence. You walk past a group sharing food quietly. Conversation is calm, reflective. There is no excess, but also no visible lack of dignity. Life continues within defined limits, but it continues steadily. Records confirm that seasonal variation affected diet significantly, with harsher periods requiring greater reliance on stored grains. A council decree proves that grain reserves were strategically distributed to offset environmental unpredictability. Your mind drifts through how survival here depends on both nature and administration working in tandem, neither fully independent of the other. A curious footnote suggests that some families preserved small symbolic portions of food during difficult times as a way of marking hope for future abundance, though scholars still argue whether this reflects ritual practice or emotional coping strategies. As night begins to settle again, cooking fires dim one by one. The smell of grain and smoke lingers softly in the air. The settlement grows quiet but not empty. It feels sustained rather than paused. You realize that in this world, food is more than sustenance. It is a reflection of structure, obligation, and continuity across generations. And as you stand in the fading light, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even the simplest meal carries the weight of the system that sustains it. You leave the quiet glow of cooking fires behind, and the road stretches forward again into a landscape shaped less by households and more by movement itself. The night is no longer just stillness. It feels traveled through as if unseen currents of people, goods, and messages are always flowing beneath its surface, even when you cannot immediately see them. Records confirm that the Qin Empire relied heavily on organized courier systems to transmit information across vast distances using relay stations positioned along major routes. A council decree proves that messengers were required to follow standardized routes and procedures to ensure that communication remained reliable and traceable. Your mind drifts through this network, where distance is continuously compressed by structured movement. You walk toward a small relay station, its structure simple but purposeful. Inside, officials prepare bundles of bamboo documents, sealing them carefully before handing them to couriers. The process is efficient, almost quiet in its precision. There is no hesitation, only silence. A curious footnote suggests that some couriers reportedly developed personal relationships with specific routes, claiming familiarity with terrain features as if they were old companions. Oddly enough, scholars still argue whether this reflects emotional attachment or practical necessity in long-distance travel. As you continue observing, you notice how couriers arrive and depart in a steady rhythm. There is little delay between arrival and dispatch. Information moves like water through channels guided but continuous. Records confirm that the courier system was essential for maintaining administrative cohesion across the empire, allowing orders and reports to travel quickly between central authority and distant regions. A council decree proves that delays or disruptions in message transmission were treated as serious administrative concerns. Your thoughts drift through how this system transforms geography. Distance no longer feels like separation. It feels like delay that can be managed. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes couriers reportedly memorizing sequences of relay stations so precisely that they could travel between them even in poor visibility or adverse weather conditions. Scholars still debate whether this reflects exceptional training or later narrative exaggeration. You move along the road and notice how relay stations are spaced at regular intervals. Each station serves as a point of rest exchange and verification. Couriers do not travel endlessly. They move in structured segments. Records confirm that relay stations also functioned as administrative checkpoints, ensuring that documents were properly registered and authenticated during transit. A council decree proves that sealing and documentation procedures were strictly enforced to prevent tampering. Your mind drifts through how trust in this system is not based on individuals, but on structure. The system is designed to function even when no single person can oversee the entire process. A curious footnote suggests that some local communities believed relay stations acted as listening points where important changes in the empire could be sensed indirectly through the arrival of couriers. Though scholars still argue whether this reflects symbolic interpretation or practical observation of communication patterns. As you continue, you notice supply movement alongside information flow. Wagons carrying grain tools and materials move in coordinated patterns, often aligned with courier routes. Communication and logistics are intertwined. Records confirm that courier routes often doubled as logistical pathways for military and administrative supply chains. A council decree proves that efficiency in transport was considered essential for both governance and defense readiness. Your thoughts drift through how the empire is structured around flow. Nothing remains static for long. Information, goods, and labor are constantly in motion. A strange anecdote describes some travelers reportedly timing their journeys to coincide with courier schedules, allowing them to benefit from established routes and station resources. Though scholars still debate whether this reflects widespread practice or opportunistic adaptation. You pause briefly at a relay station as a courier departs at speed, carrying sealed documents into the night. The movement is swift and purposeful, disappearing quickly into darkness. Records confirm that courier reliability was a key concern for imperial administration, as delays could affect military coordination, taxation updates, and regional governance decisions. A council decree proves that redundancy and structured oversight were built into the system to reduce risk of disruption. Your mind drifts through how this creates a sense of constant connectivity even in remote regions. Every place is potentially reachable, every message potentially traceable. A curious footnote suggests that some officials reportedly developed personal codes or shorthand within official communication practices, though scholars still argue whether this reflects efficiency improvements or informal adaptation within rigid systems. As night deepens further, the road feels less empty than before. Even when no one is visible, you sense the ongoing movement that defines the empire's rhythm. Couriers' goods and information continue to pass through invisible channels. You realize that in this world, silence does not mean stillness. It simply means that movement is happening elsewhere beyond immediate sight. And as you stand beside the relay station, watching the last flicker of lantern light disappear down the road, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even distance is held together by continuous motion. You leave the relay station behind, and the road begins to feel less like a conduit of movement and more like a corridor of production itself. The night air carries faint echoes of hammering, carving, and weaving from unseen workshops scattered along the empire's vast network. Even in darkness, creation does not stop here. It simply shifts into quieter, more controlled rhythms. Records confirm that artisans in the Qin Empire were organized into state-supervised workshops, particularly for producing tools, weapons, textiles, and construction materials. A council decree proves that production standards were enforced to ensure uniform quality across regions. Your mind drifts through this structured creativity where craftsmanship is not free-floating but directed toward administrative and military needs. You pass a small workshop where faint light spills through wooden slats. Inside, artisans are working with quiet concentration. Metal tools are shaped with careful repetition. Molds are reused, and measurements are checked before each stage of production. The atmosphere is focused but not chaotic. Everything follows sequence. A curious footnote suggests that some artisans believed imperfections in crafted objects could reflect imbalance in broader social order, though scholars still argue whether this reflects genuine belief systems or retrospective interpretation of production discipline. As you continue observing, you notice how workshops are not isolated spaces, but integrated into supply chains. Materials arrive from different regions, processed goods are then distributed onward to administrative, agricultural, or military channels. Records confirm that Qin production systems were closely tied to state planning, ensuring that essential goods were available where needed. A council decree proves that output quotas were sometimes assigned based on regional demand, linking craftsmanship directly to imperial requirements. Your thoughts drift through how this transforms creativity into structured labor. Skill remains important, but it operates within defined boundaries of expectation and output. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes artisans reportedly developing subtle personal signatures within standardized products, such as slight variations in finish or hidden markings, though scholars still debate whether this reflects individuality or practical production differences. You move further and notice how materials are carefully allocated. Bronze iron wood and textile fibers all move through controlled channels before reaching workshops. Nothing is random. Supply itself is organized. Records confirm that resource allocation was managed through administrative planning to ensure consistency in production. A council decree proves that shortages or inefficiencies were reported and adjusted through central oversight. Your mind drifts through how this system connects distant regions through shared production logic. Even remote workshops participate in a unified structure of output. A curious footnote suggests that some artisans developed oral transmission techniques for passing down skills, especially in regions where formal training was limited, though scholars still argue whether this reflects official practice or informal continuity. As you continue walking, you begin to see how craftsmanship blends with obligation. Labor is not just physical effort, it is structured contribution to a larger system of needs. Records confirm that skilled labor was often directed toward state priorities such as weapons manufacturing, infrastructure repair, and standardized goods production. A council decree proves that artisans could be reassigned based on imperial demand. Your thoughts drift through how stability here depends on coordination between skill and regulation. Creativity exists, but it is channeled. A strange anecdote describes workshops where workers reportedly developed rhythmic production cycles synchronized to collective timing signals, though scholars still debate whether this reflects actual practice or later symbolic interpretation of industrial discipline. You pass another workshop where textiles are being woven. The repetitive motion of weaving creates a soft, continuous sound. Patterns emerge slowly but consistently. Cloth is not just made, it is produced through regulated repetition. Records confirm that textile production was a major component of household and workshop economies, often tied to taxation requirements. A council decree proves that standardized cloth dimensions were used to simplify assessment and collection. Your mind drifts through how even fabric carries administrative meaning. What is worn is also what is recorded. A curious footnote suggests that some textile patterns may have retained local stylistic elements even under standardization, though scholars still argue whether this reflects cultural persistence or limited enforcement of uniformity. As you continue, you notice how artisans interact quietly, exchanging brief instructions or observations. Communication is efficient, minimal, and focused on task completion. Records confirm that workshop organization emphasized hierarchy and specialization, ensuring that each worker contributed to a specific stage of production. A council decree proves that efficiency and predictability were prioritized over individual variation. Your thoughts drift through how this system creates stability through repetition. The same actions, refined and standardized, produce reliable outcomes across regions. As night deepens, the workshop lights begin to dim. Production slows but does not fully cease. Even rest periods are part of scheduling. You realize that in this world, creation is not separate from governance. It is one of its quietest expressions. And as you stand outside the fading glow of the workshop, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even craftsmanship follows the rhythm of order. You leave the dim glow of workshops behind, and the road gradually widens as you approach a place where the empire no longer feels like scattered systems of labor and production, but like a concentrated center of authority. The night air carries a different weight here, less rural, less mechanical, more layered with presence, as if many unseen decisions are constantly being made just beyond your sight. Records confirm that Xianyang served as the capital of the Qin Empire after unification, functioning as the political, administrative, and ceremonial heart of centralized power. A council decree proves that major governmental functions were concentrated here to ensure direct control over regional commanderies. Your mind drifts through this idea of a city that does not simply exist, but directs existence across an entire empire. As you approach the outskirts, you begin to see signs of increasing density. Roads become busier, even at night. Carriages pass with sealed documents. Officials move between gates with quiet urgency. Everything feels coordinated, as if the city never fully rests, only shifts between levels of activity. A curious footnote suggests that some travelers describe the capital as a place where decisions are always arriving, though scholars still argue whether this reflects literal observation or later philosophical framing of centralized power. You pass through outer districts where administrative buildings begin to appear more frequently. These are not decorative structures. They are functional spaces where records are processed, reports are reviewed, and decisions are transmitted outward to the empire. Records confirm that the Qin administrative system relied on dense bureaucratic coordination centered in the capital. A council decree proves that officials in Xianyang were responsible for interpreting, refining, and distributing imperial directives across vast territories. Your thoughts drift through how governance here is not distant abstraction, but continuous processing. Information flows inward, is evaluated, then flows outward again in structured form. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes officials reportedly working in rotating shifts to maintain constant administrative activity, though scholars still debate whether this reflects actual scheduling or later interpretations of bureaucratic intensity. You continue deeper and begin to notice architectural scale increasing. Walls rise higher. Gateways become more formalized. The movement of people is more regulated, yet also more abundant. The city feels like a convergence point where many systems meet. Records confirm that the capital functioned as both administrative hub and symbolic center of imperial authority, reinforcing unity across diverse regions. A council decree proves that ceremonial spaces were integrated into urban planning to reflect political legitimacy. Your mind drifts through how physical space is used here not only for function, but for representation. The city itself communicates structure. A curious footnote suggests that some visitors reportedly felt disoriented by the capital's scale and order, describing it as too aligned to wander without purpose, though scholars still argue whether this reflects emotional reaction or later narrative embellishment. You pass through a gate where guards inspect documents with calm precision. Identity is verified not through recognition, but through written authorization. The process is efficient, almost routine, yet it reinforces the importance of record-based existence. Records confirm that access to administrative zones within the capital was strictly regulated to maintain security and order. A council decree proves that movement within key areas required proper documentation and authorization. Your thoughts drift through how even proximity to power is structured. Entry itself is conditional. A strange anecdote describes merchants reportedly timing their arrival at capital gates to coincide with administrative processing cycles, though scholars still debate whether this reflects practical adaptation or systemic predictability. As you move further in, you begin to see how different layers of society overlap here. Officials, scribes, laborers, messengers, and guards all occupy intersecting spaces, each contributing to the functioning of the center. Records confirm that the capital was designed to support both governance and logistical coordination, ensuring efficient flow of information and resources. A council decree proves that urban organization reflected broader imperial priorities of control and integration. Your mind drifts through how this city is not just a location, but a mechanism. It processes the empire itself. A curious footnote suggests that some residents of surrounding districts reportedly measured time not by natural cycles, but by administrative schedules and official movements, though scholars still argue whether this reflects adaptation or cultural shift under centralization. As night deepens, the capital does not feel asleep. Lanterns remain lit in administrative corridors. Movement continues in structured patterns. Decisions are being made, recorded, and transmitted even in quiet hours. You realize that Xianyang is not defined by stillness or noise, but by continuity of governance. And as you stand at the edge of its expanding streets, watching the layered movement of people and information, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, the capital is not just a place, it is the ongoing center of structured thought. You move deeper into the capital's structured expanse, and the atmosphere shifts again, becoming more enclosed, more deliberate, as if the city itself is narrowing into corridors of influence. The streets here are no longer simply pathways of movement. They feel like channels through which authority is constantly being refined, adjusted, and quietly contested. Records confirm that political life in the Qin capital was highly centralized, with key decisions made close to the first emperor and his inner circle of advisors. A council decree proves that access to the highest levels of governance was restricted and mediated through formal channels, ensuring that influence flowed through controlled pathways. Your mind drifts through this structure where proximity itself becomes a form of power. You pass large administrative buildings where officials move with measured precision. Inside documents are reviewed, sealed, and reallocated. The work is continuous but not chaotic. Every action follows established procedure, as if the city operates according to an invisible script. A curious footnote suggests that some observers describe the capital as having layers of silence where different levels of authority produce different degrees of quietness, though scholars still argue whether this reflects literal perception or later metaphorical interpretation. As you continue, you begin to notice the presence of courtly spaces beyond administrative zones. These are more refined, less utilitarian, and subtly more guarded. Movement becomes more restricted, and access more carefully controlled. Records confirm that the Qin court operated under strict protocols, governing attendance, communication, and audience with higher authority. A council decree proves that advisors and officials were required to present information in structured formats to ensure clarity and consistency in decision-making. Your thoughts drift through how governance here is not spontaneous. It is filtered through layers of procedure and presentation. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes officials reportedly rehearsing presentations before delivering reports, adjusting tone and structure to match expected formal standards. Though scholars still debate whether this reflects historical practice or later narrative emphasis on bureaucratic discipline. You move closer to areas where political discussions are believed to have taken place. The atmosphere feels heavier, not because of physical weight, but because of the concentration of decisions that shape entire regions beyond this city. Records confirm that central governance involved coordination between multiple advisory roles, each contributing information or analysis to the first emperor's decision-making process. A council decree proves that administrative specialization was essential for managing the complexity of the unified empire. Your mind drifts through how power here is not simply held but processed. Decisions are formed through structured input rather than isolated command. A curious footnote suggests that some officials reportedly developed reputations based on their ability to present concise and persuasive summaries of complex reports, though scholars still argue whether this reflects merit-based recognition or later idealization of administrative skill. You continue walking and notice how security becomes more visible. Guards are stationed at intervals, not aggressively, but with constant presence. Movement is guided, not unrestricted. Records confirm that the capital maintained controlled access zones to separate administrative, residential, and ceremonial areas. A council decree proves that such zoning was essential for maintaining order and protecting sensitive governance functions. Your thoughts drift through how space itself becomes hierarchical. Where you can go depends on who you are and what you carry in written authorization. A strange anecdote describes messengers reportedly memorizing entire sequences of gate procedures to ensure uninterrupted passage through restricted areas, though scholars still debate whether this reflects actual procedural complexity or later narrative dramatization. As you move further inward, you begin to sense the presence of palace-adjacent spaces. These are quieter still, with movement carefully regulated and conversation reduced to formal necessity. The architecture feels more enclosed, as if designed to contain both space and attention. Records confirm that the imperial court was structured to separate ceremonial authority from administrative execution, ensuring that symbolic and practical governance operated in parallel. A council decree proves that protocol governed nearly all interactions near the center of power. Your mind drifts through how this separation creates a layered reality where decisions are both made and represented in distinct spaces. A curious footnote suggests that some observers described court environments as places where words are shortened before they are spoken, though scholars still argue whether this reflects linguistic discipline or later poetic interpretation. You pause briefly, sensing how tightly controlled communication becomes in proximity to authority. Every phrase, every report, every interaction is shaped by expectation and format. Records confirm that formal communication in the Qin court prioritized clarity, brevity, and structured delivery to ensure efficient governance. A council decree proves that miscommunication in high-level administration was considered a serious risk to imperial stability. Your thoughts drift through how language itself becomes refined under pressure of authority, losing excess while gaining precision. As night deepens further within the capital, the movement of officials continues in measured patterns. Light glows softly from administrative halls. Decisions are still being made even in late hours. You realize that within this center of power, governance is not a moment, but a continuous process unfolding across time without pause. And as you stand near the boundary of courtly space, watching controlled movement flow through illuminated corridors, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even decision-making itself is carefully structured into form. You leave the carefully structured corridors near the heart of the capital, and the atmosphere subtly shifts again, as if the density of authority begins to loosen at the edges. The streets here are still part of Xianyang, still under the same imperial framework, but you begin to sense tension beneath the surface order, like pressure building quietly beneath stone. Records confirm that during the Qin Empire's later years, rural discontent and localized unrest increased in response to heavy labor demands and strict legal enforcement. A council decree proves that authorities actively monitored signs of disorder, particularly in regions supplying labor and resources to major state projects. Your mind drifts through this awareness, where stability and strain exist side by side. You walk through a district where movement feels slightly more uncertain. Conversations are lower glances, more cautious. People are still going about their tasks, but there is an undercurrent of awareness, as if everyone is quietly measuring the weight of current obligations. A curious footnote suggests that some residents reportedly used coded phrasing when discussing administrative burdens, replacing direct references with indirect expressions, though scholars still argue whether this reflects genuine caution or later interpretation of subtle resistance. As you continue, you notice groups gathering in small clusters, speaking briefly before dispersing. Nothing is overtly disruptive, yet the pattern suggests shared awareness of pressure points within the system. Records confirm that economic strain and labor requisition for large-scale projects contributed to localized unrest in several regions during the late Qin period. A council decree proves that officials were instructed to report and suppress disturbances promptly to maintain imperial stability. Your thoughts drift through how pressure in this system does not always appear as open conflict. Sometimes it manifests as silence, hesitation, or small shifts in behavior. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes villagers reportedly delaying official reporting of minor infractions during periods of heightened labor demand, though scholars still debate whether this reflects widespread practice or selective narrative emphasis. You move further into a district where construction sounds are audible again, not monumental projects like frontier walls, but smaller repairs, reinforcements, and maintenance within the city itself. Even the capital requires constant upkeep, as if the system cannot afford stillness. Records confirm that infrastructure maintenance within the capital was continuous, involving coordinated labor from various assigned groups. A council decree proves that repair work was prioritized to ensure uninterrupted administrative function. Your mind drifts through how even the center of power depends on ongoing extraction of labor and resources from elsewhere. Nothing sustains itself without input. A curious footnote suggests that some laborers reportedly recognized specific construction zones as recurring assignments over multiple seasons. though scholars still argue whether this reflects systematic rotation or later reconstruction of labor patterns. You continue walking and notice how official presence becomes more variable. In some areas, supervision is direct and visible. In others, it is less immediate, relying on record systems rather than constant observation. Records confirm that administrative oversight was distributed across multiple layers, allowing local officials to manage day-to-day enforcement while central authorities maintained broader coordination. A council decree proves that reporting structures were essential for maintaining control over distant or complex regions. Your thoughts drift through how control here is not always direct. It operates through delegation and documentation. A strange anecdote describes individuals reportedly altering their behavior depending on perceived proximity to officials, even when no inspection was occurring. Though scholars still debate whether this reflects behavioral conditioning or later interpretive framing of surveillance culture. As you move through the district, you begin to notice subtle signs of strain in infrastructure and daily routines. Not collapse, but friction. Systems working harder to maintain equilibrium. Records confirm that large administrative states often experience localized inefficiencies under sustained pressure, requiring continuous adjustment of labor taxation and resource distribution. A council decree proves that corrective measures were regularly implemented to address emerging issues. Your mind drifts through how stability is not static here. It is maintained through constant recalibration. A curious footnote suggests that some officials reportedly kept informal notes alongside official records to track local conditions more accurately, though scholars still argue whether this reflects adaptation within bureaucracy or unofficial practice. You pass through a quieter street where the flow of people thins slightly. The sense of tension is not dramatic, but perceptible, as if the system is holding itself together through accumulated effort. Records confirm that in centralized administrative systems, pressure points often appear first at logistical and labor-intensive nodes. A council decree proves that monitoring these points was considered essential for preventing larger instability. Your thoughts drift through how the empire is both vast and delicate structured and dependent at once. As night deepens over Xianyang, the city does not feel unstable, but it no longer feels entirely effortless either. It feels maintained. And as you stand at the edge of this shifting district, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even stability requires constant work to preserve. You leave the strained edges of the capital behind, and the atmosphere changes again, not into calm, but into something more intellectual, more contested, as if the air itself has become filled with ideas that cannot fully agree with one another. The streets here feel quieter, but the silence is not empty. It is layered with arguments that have already happened and debates that continue even when no one is speaking. Records confirm that during the Qin unification period, intellectual life became increasingly regulated, especially concerning philosophical and historical texts that were considered politically sensitive. A council decree proves that certain categories of writings were restricted or collected for state review. Your mind drifts through this moment where knowledge itself becomes something managed. You walk past a modest administrative archive building, its exterior unremarkable compared to its significance. Inside, texts are stored, reviewed, and categorized. Not everything is destroyed or hidden. Much is simply gathered into controlled spaces where access is limited and structured. A curious footnote suggests that some scholars believed Texts could lose clarity when separated from their original context, though. Scholars still argue whether this reflects genuine intellectual concern or later philosophical reinterpretation of archival practices. As you continue, you sense how ideas circulate differently here. They do not move freely through public discussion in the same way as before. Instead, they pass through official scribes and controlled channels of transmission. Records confirm that the Qin state implemented measures to regulate intellectual discourse when it intersected with governance or social stability. A council decree proves that administrative authorities were responsible for evaluating and managing the circulation of certain types of texts. Your thoughts drift through how knowledge is no longer just personal or communal. It becomes part of administrative structure. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes individuals reportedly memorizing entire texts from oral transmission before official restriction. Though scholars still debate whether this reflects historical reality or later symbolic storytelling about preservation of knowledge. You move further into a district where discussion seems more subdued but not absent. Small groups gather in quiet conversation, often speaking in careful terms. Ideas still exist, but they are shaped by awareness of boundaries. Records confirm that intellectual traditions continued to exist under Qin rule, though often adapted to fit administrative expectations. A council decree proves that officials were sometimes tasked with ensuring that public discourse remained aligned with imperial priorities. Your mind drifts through how thought itself is influenced by structure, not erased but redirected. A curious footnote suggests that some individuals reportedly used metaphor and allegory to discuss sensitive topics indirectly, though scholars still argue whether this reflects conscious strategy or natural linguistic adaptation. As you continue walking, you notice how memory plays a larger role here. In the absence of open textual circulation, oral transmission becomes more important, preserving ideas through repetition and reinterpretation. Records confirm that oral communication remained a vital part of cultural continuity even as written administration expanded. A council decree proves that spoken knowledge was not eliminated but existed alongside formal systems of record. Your thoughts drift through how knowledge becomes layered, written, spoken, remembered, and interpreted. A strange anecdote describes gatherings where stories or philosophical ideas were retold in simplified forms to avoid misinterpretation, though scholars still debate whether this reflects caution or natural evolution of oral tradition. You pass another archive courtyard where scribes are quietly working. Even in restricted intellectual environments, documentation continues. The system does not eliminate writing, it organizes it. Records confirm that archival practices were essential for maintaining administrative consistency, ensuring that approved information remained accessible while other materials were controlled. A council decree proves that preservation and restriction operated simultaneously. Your mind drifts through how knowledge here is not destroyed. It is curated. A curious footnote suggests that some officials reportedly debated the interpretation of older texts internally, even when public circulation was limited, though scholars still argue whether this reflects institutional continuity or informal intellectual resilience. As night deepens again, the district feels contemplative rather than active. Ideas do not disappear. They simply move differently through quieter channels of expression. You realize that in this world, knowledge is not only about truth or memory. It is about direction, structure, and controlled flow. And as you stand at the edge of the archive district, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even thought moves within carefully shaped boundaries. You leave the quiet weight of controlled knowledge behind, and the capital begins to feel more personal again, more intimate in its anxieties and hopes. The streets narrow slightly, leading you toward spaces where belief, curiosity, and fear intertwine in a way that feels less administrative and more human. Yet even here, the presence of the empire lingers, shaping how dreams are pursued and how uncertainty is interpreted. Records confirm that the first emperor of the Qin dynasty showed a deep interest in longevity practices and the possibility of extending life beyond natural limits. A council decree proves that expeditions and inquiries were authorized to seek knowledge of elixirs and distant techniques believed to influence vitality. Your mind drifts through this pursuit, where power turns inward toward the boundaries of mortality itself. You pass through a district where small workshops and quiet consultations take place behind partially closed doors. Not official administration, but something more speculative, more uncertain. The air feels slightly different here, as if filled with questions rather than instructions. A curious footnote suggests that some practitioners of early alchemical thought believed physical substances could be refined toward purity and transformation, though scholars still argue whether this reflects literal practice, symbolic philosophy, or later interpretations of early experimental traditions. As you continue walking, you notice references to medicinal preparation and herbal knowledge. Ingredients are dried measured and combined in careful proportions. These practices are not yet modern science, but they carry observation, repetition, and experimentation. Records confirm that medical and alchemical knowledge often overlapped during this period, blending empirical observation with cosmological interpretation. A council decree proves that certain practitioners were supported or monitored depending on their perceived usefulness to the state or court. Your thoughts drift through how the desire for longevity is not just personal. It becomes political when directed toward a ruler whose life is tied to the stability of an entire empire. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes envoys reportedly traveling to distant coastal or mountainous regions in search of rare substances believed to extend life, though scholars still debate whether these journeys were literal missions or later symbolic narratives. You move deeper into a quieter part of the capital, where discussions about fate, balance, and transformation seem to circulate in more abstract form. People speak carefully, often using indirect language when discussing matters of life change or impermanence. Records confirm that philosophical and practical traditions concerning health and longevity coexisted with administrative governance, often intersecting at courtly levels. A council decree proves that such inquiries were sometimes encouraged when they aligned with imperial interests. Your mind drifts through how uncertainty about life and death creates space for exploration, even within structured systems. A curious footnote suggests that some individuals reportedly interpreted natural phenomena such as seasonal changes or bodily conditions as indicators of broader cosmic balance, though scholars still argue whether this reflects systemic belief or later interpretive synthesis. As you continue, you notice how the pursuit of longevity is not only about substances or rituals, it is about understanding pattern cycles and perceived harmony between body and world. Records confirm that the first emperor's interest in these matters influenced court activities and state-supported inquiries. A council decree proves that such efforts were integrated into broader administrative and ceremonial contexts. Your thoughts drift through how ambition extends beyond conquest and governance. It reaches toward continuity itself, toward resisting the natural limits of existence. A strange anecdote describes individuals at court reportedly offering refined substances or techniques claiming restorative effects, though scholars still debate whether these accounts reflect historical practice, exaggerated rumor, or later moral interpretation. You pass through an area where night air feels slightly cooler, carrying faint scents of herbs and smoke. The atmosphere is neither fully scientific nor fully spiritual. It exists somewhere in between, shaped by curiosity and uncertainty. Records confirm that early experimental practices involving substances and observation contributed indirectly to later developments in medical and natural knowledge systems. A council decree proves that such practices were recorded and evaluated under varying degrees of official attention. Your mind drifts through how the search for longevity reflects both human vulnerability and imperial aspiration. The ruler's body becomes symbolic of the state's continuity. A curious footnote suggests that some observers interpreted imperial interest in longevity as an extension of broader efforts to unify not just land and law, but time itself, though scholars still argue whether this reflects historical perspective or later philosophical framing. As you stand in the quieter part of the capital, you sense how deeply this pursuit is tied to uncertainty. Even within a highly structured empire, there are limits that invite questioning. And as the night settles once more, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even the search for eternity is shaped by structure, ambition, and fragile hope. You leave behind the quiet corridors of imperial curiosity and the search for longevity, and the capital feels different, again sharper at its edges, as if something beneath its surface is beginning to shift. The streets are still structured, still orderly, but the rhythm of movement feels less assured, like a system continuing to operate while absorbing increasing strain. Records confirm that in the later years of the Qin Empire, multiple regions experienced unrest and localized rebellion driven by accumulated labor, demands, taxation pressure, and rigid legal enforcement. A council decree proves that officials were instructed to report disturbances quickly and coordinate responses to maintain stability across commanderies. Your mind drifts through this tension, where order is no longer just maintained, but actively defended. You walk through a district where activity feels more urgent. Messengers move faster. Conversations are shorter. Officials appear more frequently at intersections. There is no collapse, but there is heightened awareness, as if the system is listening more carefully to itself. A curious footnote suggests that some residents reportedly recognized early signs of instability not through official announcements, but through subtle changes in administrative routines, though scholars still argue whether this reflects historical observation or retrospective interpretation of events. As you continue, you notice increased movement of supplies and personnel through the capital. Carriages pass more frequently, documents are sealed more quickly, and administrative transitions feel accelerated. The structure is still intact, but it is under pressure. Records confirm that maintaining cohesion across the empire required continuous coordination of labor taxation and military resources, especially during periods of expansion and infrastructure development. A council decree proves that adjustments were sometimes made in response to emerging logistical or political challenges. Your thoughts drift through how complexity itself creates strain. The more interconnected the system becomes, the more sensitive it is to disruption. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes officials reportedly working extended hours during periods of unrest, attempting to stabilize administrative flow, though scholars still debate whether this reflects historical working patterns or later narrative emphasis on bureaucratic intensity. You move into a part of the capital where information seems to travel even faster than before. Couriers pass frequently, documents are processed in rapid succession, and decisions appear to be made with increased urgency. Records confirm that during periods of instability, imperial communication networks were used intensively to coordinate responses across regions. A council decree proves that rapid transmission of orders was essential for managing widespread administrative demands. Your mind drifts through how communication becomes critical during uncertainty. The same systems that unify the empire are now being used to hold it together under pressure. A curious footnote suggests that some observers believed the pace of official movement itself reflected broader political conditions, though scholars still argue whether this represents accurate perception or interpretive hindsight. As you continue, you notice that while the capital remains functional, the emotional atmosphere has shifted. Conversations are more cautious, movements are more purposeful. There is a sense of attentiveness that was less visible before. Records confirm that administrative systems often require increased oversight during periods of strain to maintain consistency in enforcement and communication. A council decree proves that reinforcement of reporting structures was considered essential to preserving order. Your thoughts drift through how systems respond to stress, not by stopping, but by tightening. A strange anecdote describes individuals reportedly interpreting increased official presence as a signal of underlying instability, though scholars still debate whether this reflects genuine perception or later narrative association between visibility and crisis. You pass through a section of the capital where construction and repair work is ongoing. Even during instability, maintenance continues. Walls are reinforced, structures are repaired. The city does not pause its own functioning. Records confirm that infrastructure maintenance remained essential even during periods of political tension, ensuring that administrative and logistical systems did not break down. A council decree proves that continuity of physical systems was prioritized alongside governance. Your mind drifts through how resilience here is built through constant adjustment rather than interruption. A curious footnote suggests that some workers reportedly developed familiarity with recurring repair cycles in specific districts, though scholars still argue whether this reflects systemic strain or routine maintenance patterns. As night begins to deepen again, the capital does not feel empty, but it feels more aware of itself. Movement continues, but with sharper edges. The structure remains intact, yet increasingly attentive to its own stability. You realize that in this moment, the Qin Empire is both functioning and watching itself function, as if aware that continuity must now be actively preserved. And as you stand within the illuminated streets of Xianyang, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even stability begins to feel like something that must be maintained against time. You remain within the capital as the night deepens further, and something in the atmosphere changes again, not sharply, but in a way that feels like pressure, slowly releasing from a tightly held structure. The streets are still active in places, still lit in others, but the rhythm of the city no longer feels entirely uniform. It feels like a system approaching its limits, while still continuing to function out of habit structure and accumulated momentum. Records confirm that the final years of the Qin Empire were marked by increasing internal strain as large-scale projects, strict legal enforcement, and centralized demands placed continuous pressure on both urban and rural populations. A council decree proves that administrative efforts were intensified to maintain cohesion across regions experiencing unrest. Your mind drifts through this fragile balance where unity and strain coexist in the same breath. You walk slowly through a quieter district of the capital. Lanterns flicker less frequently here. Officials still pass, but their movements feel less synchronized than before. There is still order, but it is no longer effortless order. It is maintained order. A curious footnote suggests that some residents reportedly notice changes not through official announcements, but through subtle shifts in the tempo of daily life, though scholars still argue whether this reflects accurate observation or retrospective interpretation shaped by later historical knowledge. As you continue, the streets begin to feel more reflective, as if the city itself is transitioning between states. Movement still exists, but it is less dense. Conversations are softer. Even the sound of footsteps feels more spaced out, as though the empire is listening to itself more carefully in its final quiet hours. Records confirm that the Qin administrative system remained functional and structured even during periods of instability, with records still being maintained, orders still being transmitted, and infrastructure still being supported. A council decree proves that continuity of governance was prioritized even under mounting pressure. Your thoughts drift through how systems like this do not collapse suddenly. They shift, adjust, and stretch under weight before any visible breaking point appears. A strange anecdote preserved in later writings describes officials reportedly continuing documentation routines even as conditions around them became increasingly uncertain, though scholars still debate whether this reflects historical persistence or later narrative framing of bureaucratic discipline. You pass through a corridor-like street where the architecture feels narrower, more enclosed. The city does not feel abandoned, but it feels introspective, as if turning inward upon itself. Records confirm that centralized systems often rely heavily on documentation and communication continuity during transitional periods to preserve coherence. A council decree proves that record-keeping remained essential for maintaining administrative identity even as political conditions shifted. Your mind drifts through how memory here is not just cultural, but institutional, embedded in written form, in seals, in structure. A curious footnote suggests that some observers later interpreted quietness in administrative spaces as a sign of impending change, though scholars still argue whether this reflects real-time perception or retrospective historical patterning. As you walk further, the city begins to feel less like a functioning machine and more like a system holding its shape through accumulated structure. Nothing has visibly stopped, but nothing feels fully stable either. Records confirm that the Qin Empire's centralized structure depended on continuous coordination between regions, officials, and logistical systems. A council decree proves that disruptions in one area required rapid adjustment across others to maintain overall cohesion. Your thoughts drift through how interconnected systems amplify both strength and vulnerability. A strange anecdote describes individuals reportedly noticing changes in courier frequency and administrative timing during this period, though scholars still debate whether this reflects genuine awareness or later historical reconstruction of systemic stress. You pause near an open space within the capital, where lantern light reflects faintly on stone and packed earth. The city feels suspended between continuation and transformation, as if holding its breath without fully realizing it. Records confirm that historical transitions in large centralized states often occur gradually through accumulated pressures rather than single defining moments. A council decree proves that administrative continuity can persist even as broader structural conditions shift. Your mind drifts through how history rarely moves in clean breaks. It moves in layers of persistence and adjustment. A curious footnote suggests that some later observers interpreted the Qin period not simply as collapse or continuity, but as transformation through structural overreach, though scholars still argue how much of this reflects historical reality versus interpretive framing. As the night settles fully over Xianyang, the city no longer feels like it is actively expanding or contracting. It feels like it is concluding a long process that has reached its natural threshold. You realize that you are not witnessing a sudden end, but the final phase of something that has been unfolding across roads, fields, courts, and workshops all along your journey. And as you stand in the quiet of the capital with lantern light fading into stillness, you begin to understand that in the Qin Empire, even an ending arrives gradually, carried on the same systems that once built everything you have seen. Sweet dreams.